Harlan Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to the Juniper Hollow Ranch house like he owned the place because in his mind he already did. He dropped a folded paper on Clara Whitlock's kitchen table without being invited to sit, without removing his hat, without so much as acknowledging that a woman was standing 3 feet away from him, holding a cast-iron skillet she'd been using to cook her own breakfast. "Sign it today," he said. "Tomorrow I drop the offer by half." Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. "Get out of my kitchen, Mr. Voss." He smiled at that, like she'd said something adorable. "You've got until sundown." Then he walked back out the same way he came indoor, swinging wide open behind him, letting in the cold Montana air, like even the weather belonged to him, and Clara was just borrowing it. If you've ever watched someone treat a person like they're already gone, like their fight doesn't matter, like their land, their work, their whole life is just a transaction waiting to close, then you already understand what kind of story this is. This is the story of a woman who refused to become a footnote on someone else's ledger, a horse that everyone said was broken beyond saving, and a quiet man who'd been running from something for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. If this is your first time finding this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us to the end, because this story goes somewhere you won't expect, and we've got more coming that you won't want to miss. Drop your city and country in the comments below. We want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves, you give it a like. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let's go back to where this really started. Montana Territory, 1887. And the morning Harlan Voss showed up uninvited wasn't the first time, and Clara Whitlock had learned a long time ago that being angry about it didn't accomplish much. What accomplished things was getting up before sunrise, pulling on her boots before the floor had a chance to warm, and going out to face whatever the day had already decided to throw at her. That particular morning, it had decided to throw quite a lot. The north pasture fence had gone down again, overnight 3rd time this month, and 2 of her cattle had wandered into the tree line before she caught them. She'd spent an hour and a half in the dark with a lantern and a temper, coaxing 2 stubborn animals back through mud that wanted to swallow her boots whole. By the time she got back to the house, her coat was filthy, her hands were raw, and the coffee she'd left on the stove had burned down to something closer to tar. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky go from black to gray when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She knew those hoofbeats. Voss rode a big gray gelding, well-fed and well-shod, the kind of horse that announced money before its rider ever opened his mouth. Clara set down her coffee cup. She did not pick up anything else. She just stood there and waited for the knock that she knew wasn't coming. The door opened. He put the paper on her table, and she told him to get out, and he smiled at her like she was a child who didn't understand how arithmetic worked, and then he left. Clara stood in her kitchen for a long moment after his hoofbeats faded. She picked up the paper. She read the number on it. She set it back down very carefully, like it might bite her. Then she went outside, because she had work to do. Juniper Hollow wasn't a large operation. 40 acres of decent grazing land, a solid barn that her late husband Edmund had built the first year they were married, a house that leaked in 2 places when it rained hard, and a small herd that had shrunk from 60 head down to 38 after a brutal winter had taken more than it should have. Clara had been running it alone for 2 years now, 2 years since Edmund's heart had simply quit on him one afternoon in the south field, so suddenly that she hadn't even known until she went to call him in for supper. She'd had about a week to grieve before the practical reality of her situation had buried the grief under an avalanche of things that needed doing. She'd learned to negotiate with the feed supplier in town, who initially tried to charge her more than he charged men. She'd learned to read cattle health the way Edmund had, through observation and patience and a willingness to ask embarrassing questions. She'd learned that some neighbors would help a widow without being asked, and some would wait to see if she failed, and some, like Harlan Voss, would actively try to make sure she did. Voss had been patient at first. He'd made what he called a fair offer for Juniper Hollow about 6 months after Edmund died, and Clara had declined it, and he'd seemed almost confused by that, like a man who'd placed a perfectly reasonable bid at auction and couldn't understand why the gavel hadn't fallen. He'd come back twice more. Each time the offer got a little less generous, and his patience wore a little thinner. The paper on her kitchen table this morning was the 4th offer. Clara hadn't done the arithmetic yet, but she's already knew what it meant. He was done being patient. She was fixing the north fence again when she first heard the commotion from the corral. She didn't need to look up to know what it was. She'd been listening to that particular sound for 3 months now, ever since she'd made what most people in Clearwater County agreed was the single most foolish purchase of her life. The black stallion. She'd bought him from a horse trader, passing through a man named Decker, who had the look of someone perpetually trying to get out from under something. The horse had been advertised as difficult but sound, which turned out to be roughly the same as calling a flooded river damp, but crossable. His name, according to Decker, was Blackjack. Clara had kept the name because she hadn't had the energy to think of another one, and because it suited him in a dark, unlucky sort of way. What she hadn't known when she bought him, what Decker had carefully not mentioned, was that someone had done real damage to the animal before she got him. Not the ordinary rough handling that most working horses had experienced at some point. Something worse. Something deliberate and sustained that had left the stallion with a fear so deep it had calcified into aggression, and an aggression so pure it had become almost architectural, a wall he'd built around himself, brick by brick, out of every bad experience he'd ever survived. He hated ropes. He hated saddles. He hated sudden movements, loud voices, and the particular sound of a leather strap moving through an iron ring. Tolerated the corral because he had no choice, but he made his feelings about that tolerance extremely clear to anyone who came within 20 feet of the fence. Most mornings, Clara went to check on him, and he'd pin his ears back and pace the far side of the enclosure like she was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. She understood the feeling. This morning, the sound coming from the corral wasn't the usual angry pacing. It was the sound of something much more urgent, hooves striking the fence rails. A high, frightened sound that Blackjack almost never made, because being frightened and being angry were two different things, and the stallion had always preferred anger. Clara dropped her fence tools and ran. She got to the corral and her stomach went cold. A ranch hand from one of the neighboring properties, a young man named Pete Grady, who worked for the Millers and had no business being on her land, had gotten into the corral with a rope. He was trying to demonstrate something to 2 other men watching from outside the fence, and from the way he was swinging the rope and laughing, it was clear he'd had the kind of morning that involved a bottle of something strong. Blackjack was at the far corner, trembling in a way Clara had never seen from him. The stallion's eyes were white-rimmed and wild. He'd already hit the fence twice. She could see the fresh marks in the wood. "Get out of that corral," Clara said. Pete turned around and gave her the grin that young men give women when they've decided not to take them seriously. "Just showing the boys what this horse is made of, Mrs. Whitlock. He ain't as tough as you think. He's tougher than you think," Clara said. "Get out of my corral right now. Give me 5 minutes. I'm not giving you 5 seconds. Get out." One of the men at the fence said something to the other that she didn't catch, and they both laughed. And that particular sound, the laugh of men who had decided that whatever she said didn't count, moved through Clara's chest like something cold. She opened the gate and walked in. That got Pete's attention, at least. He turned to face her, and in doing so, the rope in his hand moved, and the sound of it moving was exactly the wrong sound, at exactly the wrong moment, and Blackjack came off that fence corner like a thunderclap. What happened next was very fast and very loud. Pete hit the dirt. Clara dove left. Blackjack cleared the space where they'd both been standing and smashed into the far fence rail hard enough to split it. And for one terrible second, Clara thought he was going through, that she was about to watch a 1,200-pound stallion tear himself apart on broken wood. But the rail held, barely, and Blackjack spun back and stood in the center of the corral, breathing like a bellows. Head high, ears flat, every muscle in his body coiled. Pete scrambled to his feet and got out of the corral so fast he left his hat behind. The men at the fence had stopped laughing. Clara stood in the middle of the enclosure, heart hammering somewhere up around her collarbone, and looked at Blackjack. The stallion looked back at her. Neither of them moved for a very long moment. "I know," Clara said quietly to the horse. "I know. Sorry." Blackjack took one sharp step sideways, then went still again. Clara backed slowly toward the gate, keeping her eyes on him, until her hand found the latch. Pete Grady and his friends were gone by the time she got the gate closed, which was probably the wisest decision any of them had made all morning. Clara stood outside the corral, with her hands on the top rail, and worked on breathing steadily until her heartbeat came back to something that didn't feel like a structural emergency. It took a while. Then she picked up the rope she'd been planning to use for her morning session with Blackjack and looked at it. She'd been trying the same thing for 3 months. Move slow, keep the rope visible, let him see it wasn't a threat. 3 months. And this morning had put them back to about the first day. She climbed the outside of the fence, sat on the top rail, and tried to think. The problem was not the horse. She'd understood that early on, even when she was furious at him, even when he'd knocked her into the fence, and she'd had a bruise along her ribs for 2 weeks. The problem was whatever had happened before she got him, and the fact that she didn't know exactly what it was. She was treating a wound she couldn't see, with tools she wasn't sure she had. She sat there for a long time, and Blackjack stood on the far side of the corral, and neither of them made any progress. That was when she heard the voice behind her. "You've been chasing him," the voice said. "Every time he moves away from you, you follow. From his point of view, you're a predator." Clara turned around. The man was standing about 10 feet from the corral fence, which she appreciated. Most people who had opinions about horses came right up and grabbed the rail like they owned it. He was tall, maybe 38 or 39. With the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work, not from being dramatic about it. He had dark eyes and a quiet stillness about him that struck her as genuine rather than performed. She'd seen him twice before at a distance. He'd bought the Reeves property, the 60-acre spread that shared her eastern fence line, about a month ago. She didn't know his name. She hadn't gone over to introduce herself because she'd been busy, and because she wasn't sure she wanted another neighbor with opinions about how she ran her ranch. He appeared to have opinions about how she ran her ranch. "I'm aware of that," Clara said. "I've been trying to correct it." "How?" "By moving slower. That's not the problem." He nodded toward the corral. "Moving slow while still chasing is still chasing. Horses don't grade on effort." Clara looked at him for a moment. "And you are?" "Silas Mercer. I bought the Reeves place." "I know who you are." She didn't really, beyond the name she'd heard in town. "What I don't know is why you're standing on my property, telling me how to handle my own horse." "Because your fence line shares mine," Silas said, with the particular patience of a man who was used to this kind of conversation. "And if that stallion goes through the north rail, which he came about 4 inches from doing 20 minutes ago, I was in my east pasture. I heard it. He's going to be my problem too." It was a fair point. She didn't want it to be a fair point. "What would you do differently?" she asked. "I wouldn't chase him," Silas said. "I'd stop moving entirely. I've tried standing still." Standing still while holding a rope you're planning to use on him is still pressure. He can read intention, same as a person can. He paused. "How long have you had him?" 3 months. "What do you know about what happened before you bought him?" "Not much. Horse trader sold him to me. Said he was difficult." Turned out difficult was doing some heavy lifting. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not pity. She would have closed the conversation immediately if it had been pity. It was something more like recognition. "Someone used pain to try to train him," he said. "It wasn't really a question." "That's my best guess." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at Blackjack, who was still standing on the far side of the corral with his ears back, and his weight shifted like he was deciding whether this new human near the fence was worth bothering with. "What's his name?" Silas asked. "Blackjack." A faint sound that might have been close to a smile. "Fitting. That's what I thought." Another silence. Then Silas said, "I could come by tomorrow morning if you want. I'm not promising anything. But I've worked with horses that had that kind of damage before. I know what it looks like." Clara looked at him steadily. She had a particular skill, developed over 2 years of running a ranch alone, of evaluating what kind of help was being offered. There was help that came with stringsmen who wanted to demonstrate their expertise as a way of establishing authority. There was help that came with pity people who wanted to feel useful more than they actually wanted to solve the problem. And occasionally, rarely, there was help that was simply help. She wasn't sure which category Silas Mercer fell into. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 6:30. "Don't be late." "I won't be." He turned and walked back toward his fence line, and Clara watched him go, and Blackjack watched her watching him. And the whole situation felt like something that had begun before anyone had agreed to it. She didn't sleep well that night. The paper with Voss's offer number on it sat on her kitchen table where she'd left it, and she found herself looking at it from across the room the way you look at a thing you're not ready to deal with but can't stop thinking about. She'd gone over the ranch's finances after supper with the kind of painful arithmetic that always made her feel slightly ill, and the conclusion she kept arriving at was the same one she'd been arriving at for 3 months. She was not going to make it through another winter at current rates, not without something changing. The cattle contract she'd been hoping for had gone to Voss's preferred buyer, as she'd suspected it would. The feed prices had gone up in September. One of her 3 remaining horses had thrown a shoe last week, and the farrier in town now charged what felt like extortion for a house call. And Blackjack, whom she'd bought with some vague idea about his value as a breeding stallion once she'd gotten him settled. Blackjack was not settled. Blackjack was a 1,200-pound liability who was currently costing her feed money and hadn't contributed anything except splinters to the North Corral fence. She lay in the dark and went through the numbers again, and they kept coming out the same way. She thought about Voss's paper. She thought about Edmund, who had built the barn and planted the windbreak trees and named the ranch Juniper Hollow because of the stand of juniper trees along the eastern creek that bloomed spelled silver in winter. Thought about what it would mean to sign that paper and what it would mean to not sign it. She was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and the answer she woke up with was the same one she'd gone to sleep with. She wasn't going to sign it. She didn't know exactly how she was going to make that decision survive contact with reality, but she wasn't signing it. Silas Mercer arrived at 6:25. She noticed the 5 minutes. She suspected he was the kind of man who noticed things like that too. He came to the corral first, not to the house, which told her something. He stood outside the fence for a full 10 minutes before she walked out from the barn, and in that time he didn't do anything at all, just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, looking at Blackjack in the way that some people look at a thing they're trying to understand rather than a thing they're trying to acquire. Blackjack, for his part, was doing his usual morning performance of aggressive indifference, pacing the far fence, pinning his ears when he caught Silas's scent on the wind, making his feelings about additional humans clear in the particular way that large animals can make things clear without saying a word. "He's watching you," Clara said, coming up beside Silas. "I know," Silas said. "That's what I want. Most people would say that's a bad sign. It is a bad sign. But it's also attention. Attention you can work with." He kept his eyes on the stallion. Indifference is harder. Clara considered that. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing this morning." She looked at him. "I want to stand here," Silas said. "So does he, even if he doesn't know it yet. I don't have time to stand here all morning." "You don't have to." "I do." He finally glanced over at her. "Go do what you need to do. Leave me out here. If anything happens, I'll come find you." It went against every instinct she had leaving a man she barely knew alone on her property with an animal she'd already had one near disaster with. There was something in the way he'd said it that didn't invite argument. Not because he was demanding, because he was certain. She went and did her morning feeding. She came back 40 minutes later. Silas was still at the fence. Blackjack was still on the far side of the corral. But the stallion wasn't pacing anymore. He was standing still, head up, ears no longer pinned, still wary, still tense, but watching rather than threatening. It was a difference of maybe 6 degrees of posture. But Clara had been watching this horse for 3 months, and she knew those 6 degrees represented a distance she hadn't crossed in all that time. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Silas said. She believed him. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the 4th morning, Blackjack had moved to the middle of the corral when Silas arrived at the fence, which was not a small thing. The middle meant the stallion was no longer automatically putting the maximum distance between himself and the human at the fence. It meant he was thinking about it first. Silas explained things to Clara in small pieces, never more than she'd asked for, in the tone of someone who knew the information would be useful, but wasn't interested in demonstrating how much he knew. He explained that a horse that had been trained through pain learned to obey in order to make the pain stop, not because it understood what it was being asked. When the painful trainer was gone, all the obedience went with them, and what was left was a horse that associated human contact with threat and had no framework for anything else. "So you have to build the framework from nothing," Clara said, one morning while they stood side by side at the fence, watching Blackjack watch them. "From less than nothing," Silas said. Because you're not just adding. You're adding while the damage is actively working against you. How long? He was quiet for a moment. Depends on the horse. Depends on the handler. She didn't ask what that meant. Thought she understood it. On the 7th morning, Silas entered the corral for the first time. He didn't bring a rope. He didn't bring anything except himself and whatever it was he carried that made large, frightened animals reevaluate their assumptions. He walked to the center of the corral, turned sideways, not facing Blackjack, not turning his back on him, but angled, presenting as small a profile as possible, and stood there. Blackjack went to the far fence. Silas stayed in the center. This lasted for 25 minutes. Clara stood at the gate and watched and did not say anything, because she could feel without being told that sound was a variable right now, and she didn't want to add to it. Then something shifted. Blackjack took 3 steps toward the center. Stopped. Silas didn't move. 3 more steps. Clara realized she was holding her breath. Blackjack stopped about 8 feet from Silas. Head high, nostrils going reading the air. Reading the man, doing the mathematics of threat and safety with whatever part of his brain was still capable of that calculation. His ears moved in tiny increments, one forward, one sideways, like 2 separate instruments trying to pick up the same signal. Silas didn't move. The stallion stood there for a long moment. Then he lowered his head, just slightly, not submission, not defeat, just a fraction less terror. And Silas very slowly turned his body a few degrees toward the horse, still sideways, still not pressing, just acknowledging. Clara exhaled. That evening, Silas stayed for coffee, which surprised both of them, she thought. She put the pot on, and they sat at her kitchen table, and there was the particular awkwardness of 2 people who had spent a week being useful to each other in a very specific context, suddenly being in a different context, without a clear protocol. Clara noticed the way he held the coffee cup both hands, like he was warming them, even though it wasn't that cold, and the fact that he didn't look around the house with the curious inventory look that most visitors had, like they were assessing what they were dealing with. He just looked at the table, or at her, when she was talking. Where did you learn that? She asked. Working with horses that way. Father, mostly. He was a patient man with animals, he considered. Less patient with people. Are you? He glanced up. Patient with people? Either one. Depends on the person, he said. And the animal. Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. You bought the Reeves place to ranch? Cattle. Eventually. Right now, I'm still clearing equipment. You were ranching somewhere before? Pause. Not a long one, but she caught it. A few different places. She didn't push on that. There were things you learned in 2 years of living alone, which silences were doors that wanted to be opened, and which were walls that were going to stay walls regardless. That one felt like something in between, which was its own kind of information. I appreciate what you're doing with Blackjack, she said instead. I want to be clear that I understand it's your time, and I'm not taking it for granted. Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. You're working alongside me every morning. Don't think of it as doing you a favor. What do you think of it as? He seemed to think about that genuinely, which she appreciated. She disliked the kind of people who answered questions before they'd had time to actually consider them. Problem worth solving, he said finally. She nodded. That felt right. 2 weeks in, Voss came back. Not to the house this time. To the corral. Clara was inside the fence with Silas, both of them moving at the same deliberate pace they'd established. Clara on one side of the stallion, Silas on the other, Blackjack standing between them with his ears moving but his feet still when she heard the creak of a wagon in the yard. She didn't look immediately. She'd learned to finish whatever moment she was in with the horse before pulling her attention away, because Blackjack read her distractions as clearly as he read everything else. She counted to 10, then walked to the fence at the same measured pace. Voss was in his wagon watching. He had 2 men with him, not ranch hands, she thought. Kind of men who sat up straight and wore town clothes and showed up as ballast when someone was delivering a message. Mrs. Whitlock, Voss said. I see you've found yourself some company. Good morning, Mr. Voss. Time's up on my offer. I know. He glanced at Silas, who had come to stand beside Clara at the fence without making a production of it. Something moved across Voss's face, a quick calculation, quickly hidden. I'm prepared to extend a few more days, Voss said, given that you seem to have a lot going on. That's generous, Clara said. My answer is still no. Voss's expression went through several quiet changes. He was a man in his 50s who had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted, not through violence, he was too careful for that, but through the patient application of financial pressure, the kind that left no fingerprints. He had the look of someone who had never particularly respected the difference between what belonged to him and what he simply wanted to belong to him. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, with the tone of a man explaining a simple thing to someone who was making it complicated. "You know and I know that you can't make this operation work. Not for another winter. You're losing money on feed costs alone, and if that stallion you wasted your savings on throws your cattle into a panic again, you'll lose more. What I'm offering you is a fair exit. From my own property," Clara said. "From a bad situation. My situation is mine to manage." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at her. "Think it over," he said. He said it like it was a kindness. He turned his wagon and left. Clara stood at the fence until the wagon was out of sight. Beside her, Silas was quiet. "That's Harlan Voss," Clara said. "I've heard the name. He owns the Livestock Buyers Association in this county, which means he controls what price ranchers in this county can get for their cattle." She paused. "He wants my land. I gathered that. He's going to make it very difficult for me to sell my cattle at a fair price this season." Silas was quiet for a moment. "How short are you?" "I'm not asking for money. I'm not offering it. I'm asking a practical question." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with the same expression he used when he was reading Blackjack attention, without pressure. "If I can't get a fair cattle price this fall," she said carefully, "I can't cover my winter costs. If I can't cover my winter costs, I have to sell something or find a different market." "There's a livestock exhibition at the Territorial Railhead in October," Clara said slowly. She'd been thinking about this for a week, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. Independent buyers come from 4 counties. Voss can't control prices there. Silas nodded. "I need something to bring there that'll draw serious buyers. Something that'll make them come to me instead of me going to them." She looked back at the corral, at Blackjack, who was standing exactly where they'd left him, watching them with that complicated attention of his. "A horse like that. With the right papers if I can find his bloodline. Trained." The word trained sat between them for a moment. "October," Silas said. 8 weeks, he looked at the stallion. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he was going to tell her it wasn't possible, that 8 weeks wasn't enough, that she was building a plan on sand. "Then we'd better start doing more than standing," he said. The work changed after that. It became deliberate in a way that it hadn't been before, not the patient observational work of the first 2 weeks, which had been about establishing baseline trust, but something more active and more careful. Every morning they pushed the boundary slightly further. Every morning Blackjack either accepted it or didn't, and if he didn't, they went back to where he was comfortable and started again. The first time Silas touched the stallion, just the flat of his hand, briefly, on the horse's shoulder, Clara was standing 15 feet away, and she felt it through her chest like a sound too low to hear. Blackjack went rigid. Silas didn't move his hand. 10 seconds passed that felt like several years. Then Blackjack exhaled, a big shuddering breath, and his muscles went from iron to merely tense. And Silas slowly withdrew his hand and took one step back and stood with his arms at his sides and said nothing at all. Clara looked at the stallion's eye and saw something she hadn't seen in 3 months of trying. Something that wasn't fear. She started understanding things about Silas that she hadn't known to look for. She noticed that he never raised his voice, even when Blackjack was being difficult, and difficult meant dangerous. She noticed that he didn't swagger or perform confidence the way some men did, the way that announced, "I'm not afraid," and only ever made her more aware of the ways in which a person ought to be slightly afraid of a 1,200-pound animal they didn't fully know yet. He was afraid sometimes. She could see it, a small, careful attention around his eyes that sharpened when Blackjack moved unexpectedly, a fractional tension through his shoulders that the horse would have read as well as she did. But he didn't let the fear drive him, which was different from pretending he didn't have it. She asked him once, walking back from the corral in the early morning, why he'd moved around so much before buying the Reeves place. She half expected him to deflect. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might. Then he said, "I had a brother, Billy. He was 24. We were working a ranch in Wyoming, big operation. Good setup. I thought we'd be there a few years." He stopped walking. Runaway team. Wrong place. He didn't get clear in time. Clara didn't say anything. She'd learned that the right response to some things was to leave space for them. After that, Silas said, it didn't seem worth staying anywhere too long. She thought about that for a moment. Because staying means losing something. He looked at her. Yeah, and you were already carrying too much loss. He didn't answer that, but she felt the quality of his silence shift slightly the way Blackjack's ears would shift, that tiny recalibration. She didn't push. They kept walking. The halter came in the 4th week. They'd worked up to it, the same way they'd worked up to everything else slowly, by inches, by introducing it as an object rather than a tool, letting Blackjack investigate it on his own terms before it ever came near his face. Silas had spent 3 days just carrying it into the corral without putting it anywhere near the horse, letting the stallion smell it, knock it with his nose, decide for himself that it wasn't a threat. The 4th day, he offered it. Blackjack pulled back from it twice. The 3rd time, he stood still. Silas buckled it without hurrying, without talking, without doing anything except keeping his movement small and steady, and when it was done, he took his hands away and stepped back and let Blackjack stand there wearing it. The stallion's ears went in 4 different directions over the next 30 seconds. Then he shook his head once, hard, and the halter stayed on, and after another moment he dropped his head slightly, that same gesture Clara had learned to recognize, the one that was not submission but was something adjacent to trust. Clara had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt something quieter than that, something that sat in her chest in a way she didn't immediately have language for. In the 6th week, Voss moved against her cattle contract. Been expecting it. She hadn't been expecting how fast it would happen. The regional buyers syndicate sent a letter formal, bloodless, in the language of ordinary business, informing her that due to changes in their grading standards, Juniper Hollow cattle would be evaluated under a new tier system that would put her prices roughly 30% below the previous year's rate. The letter made no mention of Harlan Voss. It didn't need to. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she went out to the corral. Silas was already there. He came every morning now, had for weeks, arriving at 6:25 as reliably as the sun. He looked at her when she came through the yard and apparently read something in the way she was walking. What happened? She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some men interrupted when they were thinking of the solution. Some interrupted when they were thinking of the problem. Silas seemed to listen with his whole attention, not dividing it between what she was saying and what he was already preparing to say. October's still viable, he said when she was done. I know. The exhibition will have independent buyers from outside the syndicate's reach. I know. She looked at the corral. At Blackjack, who was standing at the near fence this morning, he did that now. Most mornings came to the fence when she or Silas appeared in the yard, which still hit her somewhere. She wasn't entirely prepared for every single time. I need him to be ready. He's coming. He needs to be more than coming. He needs to be something they remember. Silas was quiet for a moment. He will be. She looked at him. How do you know? 'Cause you're the one training him. It was simply stated, without embellishment, and that was exactly what made it hit her the way it did. She turned back toward the corral before her face could do something she'd regret. 6 weeks, she said. Let's get to work. Blackjack accepted a blanket in the 7th week. It took 3 days of patient introduction and one memorable afternoon where he expressed his opinion of the process by removing the blanket from Silas's hands with his teeth and dropping it in the mud, which Clara privately thought was fair given everything. But the 4th day, he stood still for it, and the 5th day, he stood still longer, and by the 7th day, he wore it through a full morning session without incident. The saddles was next. Clara lay awake the night before they were going to try it and stared at the ceiling and listened to the October wind beginning to develop outside and thought about the exhibition. 8 days away now. She went over the calculations again. If Blackjack performed well, if the right buyers were there, if she could get what she thought he was worth, and then she stopped herself, because she'd been in Montana long enough to know that it was an unreliable foundation for any structure you wanted to stand through winter. What she knew was this. She'd done the work. Silas had done the work. The horse had done the work in his own painful, incremental way. Whatever happened next, that part was true. She fell asleep on that. It helped, a little. The saddle went on in the morning. It did not go smoothly. Blackjack tolerated the saddle pad they'd worked up to that over 4 days. He tolerated Silas lifting the saddle itself and resting it on his back. He tolerated the weight for approximately 40 seconds, at which point he communicated his remaining thoughts on the subject by twisting sideways and coming off the ground in a movement that was not quite a buck, but was a clear indication that a buck was being considered. Silas went with it not off the horse, because the horse wasn't yet being ridden, but stepping back, giving Blackjack space to express himself without making the expression into a confrontation. They stood apart for a moment, Silas and Blackjack, both breathing. Again, Clara asked from outside the fence. Silas looked at the stallion. Call. They waited. Blackjack shook himself once, a full-body shudder, ears going forward. He looked at Silas. He looked at the saddle on the ground where it had landed. He looked at Clara. Then he took 2 steps toward Silas. Huh, Silas said softly, to nobody in particular. They tried again. This time, Blackjack stood for 2 full minutes, with the saddle on his back before his opinion became physical again. But 2 minutes was 2 minutes more than before, and they took it and moved on. By the end of the morning session, 3 hours of patient, incremental, frequently interrupted work, Blackjack was wearing the saddle and moving at a walk across the corral without trying to remove it. It wasn't elegant. His back was tense, his movements slightly stilted, his ears cataloging every sensation with the vigilance of an animal who had learned not to trust comfort. But he was walking, wearing the saddle, on purpose. Clara stood at the fence with her hands wrapped around the top rail so tightly, her knuckles had gone white, and she watched, and she felt something building in her chest that she wasn't entirely sure what to call. Not triumph. Still not that. Something older. Something that felt like recognition, like watching a thing become what it always could have been, if only someone had been willing to take the time. 8 days to the exhibition. Blackjack was not ready, but he was closer than anyone had believed possible. And Clara Whitlock had learned, over 2 very hard years on her own, that closer than believed possible was sometimes exactly enough. She looked at Silas, who was standing inside the corral with the stallion, one hand resting lightly on Blackjack's neck, while the horse decided whether or not that was all right. Blackjack decided it was. Silas caught her eye over the fence, and something passed between them, not a word, not even really an expression. Just the particular acknowledgement of 2 people who have worked alongside each other long enough to speak in the shorthand of shared effort. Clara let go of the rail. She rolled her shoulders. There was still work to do. The saddle stayed on through the morning, and that was the first real thing they'd won in a while. Clara knew better than to celebrate too early. She'd learned that with Blackjack, every step forward came with a built-in tax, a day of resistance afterward, a morning where he'd undo something that had seemed settled, a moment where the fear would resurface like groundwater through cracked earth, slow and persistent and completely indifferent to the work that had gone into keeping it out. She'd stopped being surprised by setbacks. She'd started being quietly grateful for the gains. But the saddle was something. She didn't say that to Silas. She didn't need to. He'd been there for the same 3 hours she had, and he understood the weight of what they'd just managed. When they walked back from the corral that morning, neither of them said much. The silence had a different quality than it used to. It wasn't the cautious quiet of 2 people who didn't know each other yet. It was the comfortable kind, which crept up on you without announcement and settled in before you'd had a chance to decide whether you wanted it there. Clara noticed it. She thought Silas did too. She didn't mention it. There were 7 days left before the exhibition. 7 days, and Blackjack still hadn't been ridden. She did the arithmetic on that, the way she did the arithmetic on everything practically, without the luxury of wishful thinking. They needed to get a rider on him, keep him steady under that weight, and somehow make it look controlled enough that a livestock buyer with money and options would see a horse worth investing in, and not a disaster waiting to happen in front of an audience. The math was not comfortable, but she'd been living with uncomfortable math for 2 years, and she'd learned that the answer wasn't always to find better numbers. Sometimes it was to change what you were solving for. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and thought about that. The next morning, Silas brought someone with him. He hadn't warned her, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that the someone was a woman about Clara's age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with red hair pulled back, and the particular posture of a person who spent a lot of time on horseback. She had a horse trader's eye, Clara thought. The way she looked at Blackjack when they came into the yard, quick, comprehensive, already doing the math. This is May Dunnick, Silas said. She trains cutting horses over at the Aldrich operation. I asked her to come take a look. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with a slightly careful expression that acknowledged he'd made a decision without consulting her, and was prepared to have a conversation about that, if necessary. Take a look at what? Clara asked. The horse. And the plan. He glanced toward the corral. May's been to the territorial exhibition 4 times. She knows what the buyers there want to see. Clara absorbed that. She didn't love being surprised on her own property. She also recognized good information when someone was trying to hand it to her. Mrs. Dunnick, she said, and extended her hand. May's fine. May's handshake was firm and brief. She was already looking past Clara at the corral. Is that him? That's him. May walked to the fence. She stood there for about 2 minutes, with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly, doing that same wordless assessment. Blackjack, true to his nature, moved to the far side of the corral, then seemed to reconsider, then moved back to the middle, his ears cataloging the new arrival, with the vigilance that Clara had come to think of as his baseline setting. He's magnificent, May said finally. He's also difficult, Clara said. We've had him in a saddle for the first time yesterday. 7 days to the exhibition. Yes. May turned from the fence and looked at Clara directly. She had gray eyes, the kind that didn't soften conversations. What's your plan for showing him? We're still working that out. That's not a plan. No, Clara agreed. It's a problem we're currently solving. Something shifted in May's expression, a slight reassessment, Clara thought. Like she'd been expecting deflection and gotten something else. The buyers at the exhibition fall into 2 categories, May said. The ones who want a finished animal trained, proven, ready to work. And the ones who want potential. The bloodline buyers, the breeders, the men who are looking for something they can build something on. She looked back at Blackjack. You're not going to have a finished horse in 7 days. But if you can demonstrate control, real control, not a performance, and if his papers show what I think they show, you'll have the second category eating out of your hand. What do his papers show? Silas asked. I called around after you told me about him, May said to Silas. Horse named Blackjack, Black Stallion, sold by a trader named Decker a few months back. There's only one that matches. He came out of a breeding program in Kentucky. His dam was a regional cutting horse champion. His sire had racing lines going back 2 generations. She paused. Decker didn't tell you that. No, Clara said very quietly. He did not. Decker doesn't tell people things that would raise the price. May said it without heat, just as fact. What you have there is not a damaged working horse, Mrs. Whitlock. What you have is a damaged horse with bloodlines that serious breeders will pay serious money for. The damage is a liability. The bloodlines are an asset. Whether the asset outweighs the liability depends entirely on what people see when they look at him. Clara stood with this for a moment. She thought about the number on Voss's paper, thought about the winter cost calculations she'd done, sitting at her kitchen table in the dark. She thought about what Silas had said, almost a week ago now. He will be. Because you're the one training him. Then we need to make sure what they see is worth seeing, Clara said. May stayed through the morning session, didn't interfere. She stood at the fence and watched in the same attentive way that Silas watched, reading the animal, reading the handlers, building a picture of what was actually happening rather than what someone was telling her was happening. Clara appreciated that. She dealt with enough people who arrived with their conclusions already formed and then spent their visit finding evidence to support them. What Blackjack did that morning was not a flawless exhibition. He balked twice at the saddle being tightened. He moved sideways away from Silas on 3 occasions when Silas's boot accidentally scraped against the fence rail and made a sound the stallion didn't like. He had one moment of pure panic when a crow landed on the corral post above his head, and that moment involved a lot of rapid sideways movement and one brief but convincing display of what would happen if someone had been on his back without being prepared for it. But he came back from it each time. That was the thing. He hit the edge of his fear, and then, instead of running straight through it like he would have 3 months ago, he paused, reassessed, and came back. It was the difference between an animal that had no tools and an animal that was beginning to develop them. May saw it. He's thinking, she said, when the morning session was over and they were standing outside the corral. That's not nothing. A lot of horses don't get back to thinking after that kind of damage. He's been working at it, Silas said. So have you. May looked at Clara. Both of you. She was quiet a moment. There's a man who'll be at the exhibition, Owen Burrell, out of Billings. He breeds ranch horses for the larger operations. Quality animals, working bloodlines. He's been looking for a new foundation stallion for 2 years. She paused again. I know him. If what I've described checks out with what he sees, he'll make an offer. What kind of offer? Clara asked. The kind that solves your winter problem and then some. Clara didn't respond to that directly. She didn't know how May knew about her winter problem, and she wasn't going to ask. Information traveled in this county the way water traveled downhill efficiently, and without much regard for whether it was wanted. We'll be ready, Clara said. After May left, Silas looked at Clara. We will be, he said. Not a question, something else. You don't know that. I know you, he said, and then seemed slightly surprised that he'd said it, like the words had gotten out ahead of his usual caution. Clara looked at him. The morning was cold and gray, and the wind was building from the north, and they were standing in her yard covered in corral dust. And this was not any kind of romantic moment by any standard she'd ever applied to such things. But something had shifted, and she felt it the same way she felt a change in weather in the body, before the mind had put a name to it. She said, Let's go work with him some more. And they did. On the 5th day before the exhibition, Silas got on the horse. Didn't go the way Clara had imagined it would, in the sense that she'd imagined it would be dramatic, and instead it was almost unbearably quiet. They'd spent 4 days working up to it with the same methodology they'd used for everything else, introducing the idea gradually, never forcing a moment before Blackjack had signaled he was ready for it, accepting setbacks without treating them as defeats. By the 4th day, Blackjack was moving well in the saddle at a walk, accepting the girth without protest, turning his head to look at Silas, when Silas came to his shoulder, as if to check that the person he'd decided to tolerate was still the person doing the work. That was the part that got Clara, if she was being honest with herself. The way Blackjack had started to check, to confirm. Not trusting blindly, she didn't think he was built for that. Not after whatever had been done to him, but making an active choice, morning by morning, to extend a provisional trust that he assessed and renewed based on whether the people around him kept behaving the way they'd behaved before. It was, she thought, not entirely unlike what she'd been doing with Silas. She didn't examine that thought too closely. Silas put his foot in the stirrup and came up slowly. No sudden shifts, no quick settling of weight. Blackjack went rigid beneath him. She could see it from the fence, that full-body tension, every muscle registering the new information. Silas sat very still in the saddle. He didn't ask for movement. He didn't pick up the reins. He just sat there, weight distributed, breathing steadily, and waited. 10 seconds. 20. Blackjack's right ear swiveled backward, listening to the rider. 30 seconds. The stallion exhaled, long and slow, like releasing something he'd been holding. Silas very gently shifted his weight forward by about 2 degrees. Blackjack took 1 step. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth. She did it without thinking, and then she felt slightly embarrassed about it, but there was nobody watching her, so she let it stay. Blackjack took another step, then another. By the time they'd done 1 full slow circuit of the corral, something in Clara's chest had unknotted itself that she hadn't realized was knotted. She stood at the fence with her heart somewhere up in her throat and watched the man she'd spent 2 months working beside ride the horse she'd spent 3 months not being able to approach. And the whole improbable sequence of it hit her at once the morning. Voss had put the paper on her table. The morning she'd been sitting on the fence rail with a useless rope. The voice behind her saying, keep chasing him like that, and he'll spend the rest of his life running from you. She thought, look where we are now. She thought, don't get ahead of yourself. She thought both of those things at the same time, which was a kind of mental talent she'd developed over the past 2 years, and wasn't entirely sure she was grateful for. Silas brought Blackjack back to the gate and swung down easily, and the stallion stood still for the dismount, which was its own small victory. Silas ran his hand along Blackjack's neck. Then he turned to Clara and he said something she wasn't expecting. He needs to do that with you. She started to say something sensible. Something about the exhibition being in 4 days. About the fact that she'd never been on a horse that hadn't been properly started. About the significant collection of ways this could go wrong at a moment when she couldn't afford for things to go wrong. I know what you're about to say, Silas said. Then you know I'm right. You're practically right. And it doesn't matter. He held the reins toward her. Clara, he doesn't choose me when you're standing at the fence. He goes to you. He's been going to you for 3 weeks. He's your horse. He's a horse who might put me through the fence 4 days before an exhibition that could save my ranch. He might. Silas was quiet for a moment. But he won't. How do you know? Same reason you knew Voss wasn't going to break you. He met her eyes. Because I've been watching both of you long enough to know what you're made of. Clara stood at the gate, looking at the reins in his hand. She looked at Blackjack, who had turned his head and was looking at her with those dark, attentive eyes, ears forward now. Relaxed that particular expression she'd started thinking of as his version of interest. The face he made when he'd decided the thing in front of him was worth paying attention to. She took the reins. She put her foot in the stirrup. She came up slowly. Blackjack's back went tense under her, different from with Silas. She thought, different weight, different balance, different smell, and she sat very still the way she'd watched Silas sit, and she breathed, and she waited. 10 seconds. The stallion shifted 1 foot, but not away. Adjusting. 20 seconds. His ear came back toward her. 30 seconds. She picked up the reins, very lightly, just enough contact to let him feel her hands, and she put the smallest possible leg against his side. Blackjack walked forward. Not explosively, not reluctantly. He just walked, like he'd been doing it all his life. Like this was a conversation between 2 people who already knew each other and were taking a walk together because neither of them had anywhere better to be. Clara rode to the center of the corral and turned him left, and he turned. She brought him back around and turned him right, and he turned. She brought him to a halt, and he stood still under her, and the October wind came over the fence and moved through his mane. And Clara sat on the back of the horse everyone in Clearwater County had told her was worthless, and looked at the sky and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She felt like Juniper Hollow was going to be all right. She didn't say that. She climbed down because she wasn't the kind of person who sat in the saddle being sentimental when there was still work to be done, and she handed the reins to Silas. And she said, "We need to work on his responsiveness at a trot before Thursday." Silas's expression did something complicated. "Yes," he said. "We do." That evening she found him still in the yard after dark. She'd gone out to do a last check on the barn she always did, had done it since Edmund died. That final circuit around the property before sleeping that was equal parts practical, and whatever the less nameable thing was, and she found Silas sitting on the top rail of the corral fence in the dark, not doing anything in particular, just being there. Blackjack was on the near side. She could see the darker shape of him in the low light, standing close to the fence, close to Silas, which 4 months ago would have been an impossibility on the order of rearranging geography. Climbed up and sat on the rail beside him. They sat for a while without talking. "You're worried about something," she said. "Not about the exhibition." "About what, then?" He didn't answer immediately. Blackjack shifted his weight, his breath a soft sound in the dark. The temperature was dropping proper October cold now, the kind that meant business. "When I bought the Reeves place," Silas said, "I told myself it was just another property. Something to work for a few years. And it's starting to feel like something else." He was looking at Blackjack, not at her. "I'm not sure I know what to do with that." Clara was quiet for a moment. She'd had a version of this conversation with herself many times, the version where she examined what she felt about the mornings with Silas, the coffees at her kitchen table, the way she'd started listening for his horse in the yard before she'd even consciously registered that she was waiting for him. She'd had the conversation and not reached a comfortable conclusion, which was its own kind of answer. "You could do something about it," she said. "Or you could decide it's simpler to keep treating it like a temporary arrangement and leave the question alone. Which would you recommend?" She looked at him. The dark made it easier somehow. "I think you already know what I'd recommend, Silas. I think you've known for a while." He was quiet. "I'm not trying to pressure anything," Clara said. "That's the last thing I want. But I'm also not interested in pretending I don't know what this has been." She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "The corral, the yard, all of it, whatever it is." Silas turned to look at her. They were close enough on the fence rail that she could see his expression, despite the dark, that careful attention he had, the one that never quite had an agenda behind it. "I'm not good at staying," he said. It came out straightforwardly, without self-pity. which was the only way she could have received it. "I know that," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just saying I'd rather both of us know what's true than spend time pretending it isn't." Blackjack shifted again. His nose came to the fence rail between them, a soft investigative touch, and Clara put her hand out and let him breathe against her palm the way he'd started doing in the mornings. Silas watched that for a moment. "He trusts you," he said. "Getting there." "No," Silas's voice was quiet and certain. "He trusts you. That's not the same thing as getting there. That's already there." He paused. "You did that. Not me. We did it." He shook his head slightly. "I showed you the method. You're the one he chose." Clara looked at the stallion's dark face, the warm breath against her hand in the cold air. She thought about what that meant and what it didn't mean, and what both of those things might be trying to tell her about something larger. "Get some rest," she said finally. "We've got 3 more days." He climbed down from the fence. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. For what it's worth, he stopped. Started again. "I'm not thinking about this as temporary." He said it like a man delivering news he'd been carrying a long time and was relieved to finally set down. Then he walked back toward his fence line and disappeared into the dark, and Clara sat on the top rail of the corral for a while after he was gone, with Blackjack's breath warm against her hand. She thought, 4 months ago, this corral held an untouchable horse, and this property was about to be taken from her, and she was eating dinner alone every night, and the silence in the house, after dark, was the kind that sits on your chest. She thought, look where we are now. She let herself mean it this time. Voss made his move 2 days before the exhibition. She should have expected it. She had expected it, in the abstract sense that she'd known something was coming, because Voss wasn't a man who watched his plans slip sideways without doing something about it. What she hadn't expected was the form it took. A man came to the ranch, not Voss himself, but one of his men, a quiet fellow named Briggs who wore his authority lightly, and came alone and spoke carefully. He told Clara that the Clearwater County Livestock Association had received a formal complaint about the Juniper Hollow stallion. The complaint alleged that the animal was dangerous, unmanageable, and a public liability. Pending investigation, the association had the authority to prohibit the horse from participating in public exhibitions. He handed her a document. Clara read it while Briggs stood in her yard. It was legal. Or it was legal-looking, which in her experience amounted to the same thing until you could get someone to tell you differently. And the only lawyer within reasonable distance was a man named Carver, who handled a significant amount of Voss's business and had always been very pleasant to Clara in the particular way that people are pleasant when. They've already decided you're not going to be a problem. She asked Briggs, who had filed the complaint. He told her the complainant wished to remain anonymous, which was a formal way of saying she already knew the answer. She told him she'd look into it. He left. She stood in her yard holding the document and felt the specific kind of anger that wasn't hot, the cold, flat kind that sits behind the eyes and makes everything very clear and very sharp. Then she went to find Silas. He read the document twice. He handed it back to her without saying anything immediately, which she'd learned to recognize as the sign that he was actually thinking, and not just preparing to talk. "May Dunnick," he said finally. "What about her? She knows Voss. Not as a friend she can't stand him. She told me as much. But she knows how he operates." He looked at the document. "She'll know if this has teeth. Can you get her here today? I'll ride over." He was gone within the hour, and Clara spent that hour doing the things she did when she was angry and scared, and didn't have enough information to act on yet, which was work. She brought in the cattle from the east pasture. She cleaned the barn. She repaired the gate hinge that had been loose for a week. She did all of it with the particular focused energy of a person who has realized that standing still is what the other side is counting on. May arrived with Silas in the early afternoon and read the document the way she'd looked at Blackjack that first morning, quickly, thoroughly, building her picture before she said a word. "It's real," she said. "The association does have this authority." But she folded the document and held it out. The authority exists for animals that have caused documented harm. An injury. A confirmed incident. She met Clara's eyes. "Has this horse injured anyone?" "Pete Grady got scared and fell down," Clara said, "by his own stupidity." "Was it documented anywhere? A report? A witness statement?" "Not that I know of." Then this May held up the document, "is a threat. A very effective one. Because you don't have time to fight it through official channels before Thursday." But it's not an executed action, not yet. She paused. Here's what I know about Voss. He uses the process the way some men use a knife not to cut, but to make you flinch. He's hoping you'll pull out of the exhibition voluntarily, because then he doesn't have to follow through and he hasn't spent any formal authority. And if I don't pull out, then he has to decide whether to escalate. And escalating means committing to a fight that goes on the record. She folded her arms. He doesn't like things on the record. He operates in the space where people back down before it gets that far. Clara looked at the document in May's hand. I'm not backing down, she said. May looked at her steadily. No, she said. I didn't think you were. She handed the document back. I'll come to the exhibition. I know 3 of the 7 association officers. If Voss tries to move on this publicly, he's going to find that process cuts both ways. The night before the exhibition, Clara couldn't sleep again. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and ran through everything that could go wrong, which was a long list, and then she made herself stop and run through everything that had already gone right, which was, she realized, also a long list, though she'd been too busy to assemble it recently. Blackjack was writable. She had bloodline documentation, which May had helped her track down from a horse breeding registry in Kentucky through a telegram exchange that had taken most of the previous week. She had May, who knew the buyers and knew the field. She had Silas, who she stopped herself there. She didn't know exactly what she had with Silas. She knew what she felt, and she knew what he'd said on the fence rail, and she knew that she'd spent a careful 2 years not letting herself need anything from another person. Partly out of practicality and partly out of a self-protection that had become so habitual, she sometimes forgot it was a choice rather than a personality trait. She knew that the past 4 months had been quietly dismantling that particular defense one morning at a time, and she knew that she wasn't entirely sure whether that frightened her or relieved her. Probably both. She listened to the wind. She thought about Blackjack, the terrified animal in the far corner of the corral that first morning, and the horse that had walked under her with calm, deliberate steps and turned left when she asked him to turn left. She thought about all the space between those 2 things. All the patient, difficult, unremarkable, incremental work. She didn't know how the exhibition was going to go. She knew they'd done the work. She got up at 4 in the morning and started preparing, because that was what you did when you'd done the work, and the next step was putting it in front of the world. You got up, and you got ready, and you went. The wagon was loaded by 5:30. Silas was there at 5:25. Of course he was. He didn't say good morning. She didn't either. They moved around the yard doing the remaining preparations in the particular efficient silence of people who knew how the other one moved. And when everything was loaded and Blackjack was haltered and walking calmly beside Clara toward the wagon, walking calmly with a halter, which had been science fiction 3 months ago, Silas stopped beside her and looked at the stallion and then at her. Ready? He asked. Clara looked at the horse. She looked at the road ahead. She thought about Voss's paper on her kitchen table. She thought about Edmund's barn and the juniper trees along the creek, and 2 years of doing hard things alone, and 4 months of learning that alone wasn't the only way to do hard things. Ready, she said. They went. The road to the territorial railhead took 3 hours by wagon, and Blackjack traveled it better than Clara had any right to expect. She'd been prepared for problems. She'd loaded the wagon with that particular careful optimism of someone who plans for the best and quietly packs for the worst extra rope, a spare halter, folded blanket, in case the stallion worked himself into a sweat and needed cooling before they arrived. She'd thought through what she'd do
if he pulled back on the lead line, if the wagon noise unsettled him,
if they passed another team on the road and the interaction went badly. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the possibility that he'd simply walk. Not perfectly. He startled twice, once at a pheasant that erupted from the roadside grass, once at a loose shutter banging on an abandoned outbuilding they passed about a mile from the railhead. Both times he jumped sideways. Both times he pulled against the lead. And both times Clara held the line steady and talked to him in the low, matter-of-fact voice she'd developed over months of corral work. And both times he came back to himself within 30 seconds. She was leading him from horseback, riding her steady gray mare alongside the wagon while Silas drove. That arrangement had been Silas's suggestion, and she'd agreed with the logic Blackjack was more settled when Clara was near him, had been for weeks, and putting her on the mare beside him gave him a familiar anchor without the additional complexity of having her on his back on an unfamiliar road. "He's doing well," Silas said after the second startle had resolved. "Don't say that yet," Clara said. "Why not?" "Because every time someone says that about this horse, he hears it and decides to prove them wrong." Silas almost smiled. "That sounds like someone else I know." Clara didn't answer that, but she felt it land. The Territorial Livestock Exhibition was held at the Millhaven Railhead, which was a permanent facility that hosted cattle auctions throughout the year and expanded twice annually into something larger, a multi-day event that drew ranchers, buyers, breeders, and traders from 4 counties and occasionally further. Clara had been twice before, both times with Edmund, both times as a buyer of modest livestock rather than a seller of anything significant. It looked different from this side. The grounds were already crowded when they arrived, the holding pens filling with cattle and horses from operations that had left before dawn to make the distance. She could hear it before she could see it, the low, continuous sound of animals and men in commerce, underlaid by the smell of hay and horses and the particular sharp, clean scent of October air when it mixes with the warmth of livestock in numbers. Blackjack heard it too. His head came up. His nostrils went wide. Pulled against the lead, not panicked, not yet, but alert in the way of a horse suddenly understanding that the world was much larger than the corral he'd been living in. And he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. Clara put her mare closer to his shoulder. "Easy," she said. "You've heard worse than this. That crow on the fence post last week was louder." He flicked one ear back toward her voice. She kept talking. Not to soothe him. Exactly, she'd learned that soothing voices often had the opposite effect, registering to a worried horse as confirmation that there was something to worry about. Talk to him the way you talk to someone you're walking beside on an unfamiliar street, conversationally, matter-of-factly, as if the whole thing were already decided, and they were just going through the motions of arriving. Silas found their assigned space in the exhibition area, a pen at the far end of the horse section, which was good, less traffic, less noise. He'd arranged it through May, who had connections with the exhibition organizers that Clara hadn't known to leverage, and May had simply leveraged without being asked, which was the kind of practical competence Clara had come to appreciate enormously. They got Blackjack settled in the pen. He circled it twice, checked the corners, checked the fence, and then stood in the center and looked at everything simultaneously, ears rotating like instruments, trying to pick up every signal at once. He was tense but contained. Clara stood inside the pen with him for 20 minutes while Silas dealt with the wagon and registration, just being present, being the familiar thing in the unfamiliar place. Gradually, incrementally, the tension in the stallion's back eased by 1 degree. Then another. She thought, "That's us. That's exactly what we've been doing for 4 months. 1 degree at a time." May found them an hour after they arrived. She had a man with her 50s, broad through the chest, the kind of face that had negotiated 1,000 transactions without losing its capacity to seem merely curious rather than calculating. He wore a good coat and plain boots, and the combination somehow announced money more effectively than if he'd worn the money on the outside. "Owen Burrell," May said. "Clara Whitlock, Silas Mercer." Burrell shook hands with both of them in the brief, assessing way of a man who formed opinions quickly and revised them slowly. Then he looked at Blackjack. The stallion was standing at the far side of the pen, still doing his surveillance of the grounds, still tense, but no longer radiating the kind of alarm that had a name attached to it. Burrell put both hands on the top rail and looked at the horse for a long time without saying anything. Clara waited. She'd learned, from watching Silas with Blackjack, that the person who spoke first in a silence usually lost something. "He's Kentucky bred," Burrell said finally. It wasn't a question. "His papers came through last week," Clarissa said. Dam was Millstream Queen, 2-time regional cutting champion. 1,000, 881 and 1,883. Sire had 3 generations of racing bloodlines. Burrell nodded slowly. He was still looking at the horse. "I heard he was damaged," he said. "He was. He's not what he was. May tells me you trained him yourself." "May helped. Silas helped. He's my horse." Burrell looked at her then, just briefly, with the particular attention of a man reassessing the whole equation. "Can he be ridden?" he asked. "Yes." "Here today?" "Yes," Clara said, and did not qualify it. Burrell looked back at Blackjack. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper, which he handed to Clara without ceremony. It was a preliminary offer, a number at the top. Clara read it, kept her face from doing anything. It was a discipline she'd been developing for 2 years, the particular frontier skill of receiving information without broadcasting your response to it before you'd had time to decide what your response actually was. The number was significant. It was more than half of what Voss had offered for the entire ranch. For one horse. She folded the paper. "I'll consider it," she said. Burrell's expression suggested he found that response satisfactory. "I'll be here through tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to see him move before I finalize anything." "You will," Clara said. He left with May, who gave Clara a look over her shoulder as they went, the particular look of a woman who has just watched another woman handle something correctly and wants to acknowledge it without making a production of it. Clara turned to Silas. "How much?" he asked. She told him. Silas looked at her steadily. "Don't sell," he said. Came out quickly, like it had been waiting. She blinked. "That number would... I know what it would do. Don't sell him." He held her gaze. "Clara, listen to what I'm saying. That horse is not a transaction. He's the beginning of something. If you sell him now, you take the money and you survive one winter. If you keep him..." He stopped. May said Burrell wants a foundation stallion for a breeding program. That's what Blackjack is. You could build that program yourself. Clara looked at the horse. She thought about the number on the paper. She thought about what Silas had just said, and the fact that he'd said it fast, like a man who cared about the outcome, rather than a man performing caring about the outcome. "I need to get through this winter first," she said. "Then let me help with that. I told you I'm not takings." "Not money," he said. "A partnership, a formal one, if that's what makes it sit right with you. My cattle, your land, split the expenses and the profits until you can stand on your own with the breeding operation." He was quiet for a beat. "I'm not trying to make you owe me something. I'm trying to make a practical argument." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "We can talk about it," she said. "After today." "Fair." She looked back at Blackjack, who had come to the near fence of his pen and was watching them with his ears forward, that attentive, considering look that she'd learned to trust more than almost any other signal he gave. "Right now," she said, "I need to get him ready to ride." She hadn't planned to ride him herself in front of the crowd. The original plan, such as it was, she'd never fully committed to a plan, because her experience with plans involving Blackjack had taught her to hold them loosely, was that Silas would demonstrate the stallion's responsiveness. Silas was the more experienced rider, had gotten on Blackjack first, and presenting a competent male rider on a difficult horse was the kind of image that translated clearly to buyers who expected a certain picture. That was the practical calculation. What she hadn't calculated was Voss. He arrived mid-morning. She saw him before he saw her. He was moving through the cattle section with 2 men at his shoulders, and the particular proprietary ease of a person who considered this space to belong to him in some essential way, which in the sense of political influence it more or less did. He was talking to someone, gesturing expansively, and Clara watched him from 30 yards away and felt the cold, flat anger from 2 days ago resurface with perfect clarity. He saw her when he turned. His expression went through a quick private calculation, and then settled into something that passed for sociable. He came over. "Mrs. Whitlock, I wasn't sure you'd make it." He looked at Blackjack in the pen. "So you did bring him?" "I did. Brave." He said it in the way that makes brave sound like foolish. "I hope, for your sake, he doesn't cause any incidents. The association officers are very attentive about liability at these events." "I know," Clara said. "I spoke with 3 of them this morning." Something flickered across Voss's face. "There and gone." "I see you've made friends," he said. "I've been making friends for 2 years, Mr. Voss. You just weren't paying attention." The men at his shoulders were watching. Voss was aware of that. "My offer still stands," he said. Quietly, for her ears, last chance before winter. "And my answer still stands." He looked at Blackjack once more. He looked at Clara once more. Then he turned and moved off through the crowd, and the men at his shoulders went with him, and Clara turned back to the pen and found Silas standing behind her. "He file anything with the association?" Silas asked. "Not yet. May says he's watching." She put her hands on the top rail. Blackjack was watching Voss go that stallion instinct for identifying the threatening figure in a crowd operating exactly as it had always operated. "He's going to say something when I ride. Something to the crowd." Something that makes it harder. Probably. So I need it to be better than he's expecting. Silas was quiet for a moment. It will be, he said. But not because of him. She understood what he meant. She nodded. Help me saddle him, she said. The horse section of the exhibition had an open demonstration area, a flattened oval of packed earth surrounded by rope fencing that buyers and bystanders could watch from. Demonstrations were informal. You simply brought your animal in and worked it, and the crowd gathered if the animal was interesting and drifted away if it wasn't. Word had gotten around about Blackjack. She wasn't sure how May's doing, she suspected, or the organic telegraph of a livestock community where interesting information moved faster than horses. By the time she led Blackjack toward the demonstration area, there were already 40 or 50 people at the rope line, which was more than she'd expected and less than she had time to be nervous about. Silas walked beside her and Blackjack. The stallion was tense. Of course he was new ground, new smells, a crowd of people at close quarters, the general sensory chaos of an exhibition day building toward its noon peak. She could feel it through the lead line, that particular tension that was different from his early fear, because it wasn't the freeze and flee tension of something overwhelmed. It was more like the tension of something alert, something paying attention. She paused outside the demonstration area and stood with him for a moment. Hey, she said quietly, to the horse. He looked at her. I know. It's a lot. But you know me. And you know you can handle things now. She ran her hand along his neck, the gesture so habitual by now it was nearly unconscious. Let's just do what we do. She led him in. The crowd shifted and settled, the way crowds do when the thing they came to see has arrived. Clara heard pieces of conversation, someone asking someone else who that was, a voice saying that's the Whitlock woman. She's got that crazy stallion, and she cataloged them and let them go. The information wasn't useful right now. What was useful was the ground under her feet and the horse at the end of her lead and the saddle she was about to put on him in front of 50 people who were waiting to see what happened. She saddled him there, in the middle of the demonstration area, the same way she did it every morning at home, slowly, deliberately, without rushing any step. Blackjack shifted once, twice, worked through it. She buckled the girth and stepped back and let him stand for a moment the way they always did, letting him adjust to the weight and the feel before anything was asked of him. Crowd was quiet. That surprised her a little. She'd expected the ambient noise to continue, but something about what they were watching had made people lower their voices. The way people get quiet when they're not sure what they're seeing yet and don't want to miss the moment it becomes clear. Put her foot in the stirrup. Blackjack tensed. She felt it the second her weight came into the stirrup, that full body tightening, those muscles going from ready to braced. She paused there, one foot in the stirrup, not mounting yet, just letting him register the weight without the additional variable of her, settling onto his back. 10 seconds. His right ear swiveled toward her. She came up. The stallion went rigid. She sat still. She breathed. She waited. And then in front of the crowd, in front of the buyers and the breeders and the men from the association and Harlan Voss, who had appeared at the rope line somewhere to her left, she hadn't looked, but she knew he was there. Blackjack exhaled that long, slow breath, and his back softened under her by the same fraction it always did. Picked up the reins. She put her leg against his side. He walked. The crowd made a sound. Not applause, something quieter and more genuine than applause. The sound of 50 people exhaling at the same time. She worked him for 20 minutes. Walk, halt, turn, walk the other direction. A circle in each direction. A halt in the middle and a backing step, which they'd only practiced 3 times, and he got it right twice, which was 2 more times than she'd had a right to expect. She didn't push him past what he'd practiced, didn't try to build something new in front of an audience, which was the first rule Silas had ever stated. In words, never ask a horse something new under pressure, because the pressure changes the question. She kept it simple. She kept it true. And Blackjack gave her exactly what she'd given him everything he actually had, honestly, without performance. It wasn't flashy. His neck wasn't arched in the way of a show horse. His movement wasn't extravagant. He was a working horse on a working day, doing the work that had been asked of him. And the only remarkable thing about it was that 6 months ago the word impossible had been the universal consensus about whether it could happen at all. She brought him to a halt in the center of the area. She heard Voss's voice from the rope line. He was talking to someone beside him, Not shouting, but carrying the kind of voice that's been trained to project without appearing to. Mercer trained that horse. Everyone here knows that. Just sitting on it. Clara sat on Blackjack's back and felt the stallion's ears rotate toward the voice. She felt the tension come back into his shoulders. She felt the question in his body, is this a threat? She made herself breathe. She made herself stay close in the saddle because she'd learned that her body was a language. Blackjack read fluently, and tightening in response to Voss would transmit directly down through the saddle and into the horse's back, and he would feel her fear before she'd finished having it. She kept her hands soft. She kept her seat quiet. She looked straight ahead, not at Voss, not at the crowd. From somewhere at the rope line, she heard a woman's voice, not May, someone she didn't recognize, say clearly, "Looks like she's riding it just fine to me." A few people laughed. Not at Clara, at Voss. The particular laugh that a crowd produces when someone important has said something that's just been publicly contradicted by reality. Voss went quiet. Clara sat on Blackjack and breathed. She was leading the stallion back toward his pen when the weather changed. It happened the way Montana weather changes in October, without much warning and without any particular interest in your plans. The sky that had been clear and cold all morning went gray in the west, then darker gray, and by the time she'd gotten Blackjack back to the pen and was working the halter, temperature had dropped 4 degrees, and the wind had come up with the sharp particular energy that meant something serious was coming. She looked at Silas. He was looking at the sky. "How long?" she asked. "An hour. Maybe less." He was right. It was less. The storm hit the exhibition grounds at noon with the kind of authority that reminded everyone present that October in Montana was not a season that negotiated. Rain first, then sleet, then wind that leaned against the structures and tested their opinions about staying upright. The holding pens went noisy, cattle pressing together, horses pulling against their leads, the whole audible vocabulary of penned animals deciding that the world had become unreliable, and they had feelings about that. Blackjack heard it before it arrived. He started pacing at the back of his pen, short, tight circles, his breathing going quick and shallow. Clara went into the pen with him immediately. She'd learned to read the early signs, the difference between manageable anxiety and the kind that preceded something structural, and put herself in his line of sight and talked. He looked at her. He kept pacing. "I know," she said. "I don't like it either. But you're okay. The fence is solid. Nobody's going to hurt you." The sleet came down hard and Blackjack's pace tightened, and she could seize in his eye that the calculus of trust versus fear was running very close to a dangerous answer. Then the fence went. Not the pen fence, the holding fence on the far side of the cattle section, a temporary structure that had been adequate for ordinary conditions and was not adequate for this one. It went in 2 places simultaneously, and 40 cattle found themselves in possession of an option they hadn't had 30 seconds earlier. And they took it the way frightened cattle always take options. All at once, in the same direction, with complete commitment. The direction was toward the horse section. What followed was the kind of chaos that has its own terrible momentum: cowboys shouting, horses screaming, the ground shaking with the impact of running cattle, people at the rope lines scrambling backward, and some of them falling. The exhibition grounds went from controlled activity to uncontrolled emergency in about 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, Clara stood inside Blackjack's pen with one hand on the stallion's neck and felt him go from anxious to something that was barely this side of explosive. She heard Silas's voice outside the pen, close. "Clara, bring him out." "What?" "Bring him out. The fence won't hold if the cattle hit it. You need room to move." She looked at the approaching cattle, maybe 40 head, being turned and harried by 2 cowboys on horseback, who were working hard and not quite working fast enough. The herd's direction was shifting, but hadn't shifted enough yet. "Clara." Silas's voice was calm. That was the thing about it. Not performing calm, actually calm. The way a person is calm when they've seen bad things before and have learned that the calmer they stay, the better their chances of making it through to the other side. Trust the horse. She looked at Blackjack. The stallion was wound up like a spring, but his eye was still on her. Still checking. Still doing that thing he'd started doing months ago. That active renewal of trust, moment by moment. She unlatched the pen gate and let him out. He burst forward, 2 steps the second they cleared the gate, and she held the lead and went with the movement rather than against it. The way Silas had shown her in the first weeks: don't create a fight unless you have to. because a fight uses energy that could be used for thinking. She let Blackjack have the 2 steps and then put herself back into his vision and said, "Here, right here." He stopped. She stood with him for 3 seconds, which was about all the time available. Then she looked at the cattle, still coming, still chaotic, still being inadequately turned by 2 exhausted cowboys on horses that were themselves starting to flag. She looked at Silas, who was on his own horse now, materialized from somewhere in the chaos, with the particular competence of a man who knew how to move fast without making things worse. He caught her eye, and she knew what she was about to do before she'd consciously decided it. Put her foot in the stirrup. She heard someone shout. She thought it might have been Voss. The word "don't," or maybe "stop." She wasn't sure, and she came up into the saddle, and Blackjack's back went tense, and she made herself stay loose. Made herself breathe. Made herself be the thing he was checking for. His back softened. She turned him toward the cattle. There was a moment, just a moment, a fraction of a second that felt much longer where the fear won. She felt it in her own body, and felt it echo back through the horse beneath her, that mutual recognition that what they were about to do was not safe and not certain, and could go very badly in ways that were easy to visualize. She loosened the reins. Both of them made the same choice at the same moment. Couldn't explain it any other way. She loosened the reins, and Blackjack moved forward, not explosively, not blindly, but with the particular directed energy of an animal that has decided to engage rather than flee. And Clara worked with him the way she'd learned to work with him, not directing him step by step, but keeping her weight and her balance in conversation with his movement, trusting that the instincts she'd spent months learning to listen to knew something about cattle and chaos that her own mind couldn't fully articulate. They hit the edge of the running herd together. Silas was already there from the other side, his horse cutting left, pressing the cattle away from the collapsed section and back toward the grounds. And Clara brought Blackjack in at an angle she felt, rather than calculated. The stallion's body telling her where the gap was before her eyes found it. Pressed right, Silas pressed left, and the 2 cowboys who'd been losing the battle for 20 minutes suddenly had a third and fourth presence, working the same problem from the angles they'd been missing. Cattle slowed. The lead animals hit the new pressure from Clara and Blackjack and turned, and turning animals turn other animals, and the whole chaotic mass began to reorganize itself into something manageable. It was not elegant. She nearly lost her seat twice once, when Blackjack had to dodge a steer that came sideways without warning, once. Once the sleet intensified suddenly, and he startled at the change in sound and came up slightly in front before she brought him back. She got wet. She got mud on her coat from a cattle kick that went wide and hit the ground and scattered. She probably said some things she wouldn't repeat in polite company, but she stayed on, and Blackjack stayed under her. By the time the cattle were fully turned and moving back toward the repaired section of fence, with 4 cowboys now working them properly, and the worst of the storm beginning to ease, Clara was breathing hard and her arms ached from the sustained conversation with the reins, and the stallion beneath her was blowing through his nose and trembling slightly, not from fear, she thought, from the particular aftermath of something that had been fully committed to and successfully completed. She brought him to a halt. She put her hand on his neck. "Good boy," she said very quietly. "You were so good." Blackjack's head dropped. Not far, just enough. That gesture she'd come to know, as well as anything in her life, not submission, not defeat, but the particular release of tension that meant the worst of the decision was over, and he'd come through it, and she'd come through it with him. She looked up. The storm was passing west the way October storms often did, hard and fast and already moving on. The exhibition grounds were settling back into something like order, people moving to check fences and animals, the vocal chaos dialing down as the emergency resolved. The crowd at the rope line, the people who'd been watching the horse section when the fence went, was still there. Some of them had been running and had stopped running. Some of them had been watching the whole thing from where they stood, which Clara only now understood meant they'd watched her ride into a cattle run on an animal that 3 months ago couldn't be touched. She heard a sound. It took her a moment to identify it, because it was not a sound she'd expected or prepared for. People were applauding. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that comes out of a crowd that has just seen something that surprised them, something that turned out to be different from what they expected, something that made them feel something they didn't have a word for but recognized as important. Clara sat on Blackjack's back and felt the sound come over her like weather. She didn't look for Voss. She looked for Silas. He was 20 feet away, his horse standing still, both of them looking at her with an expression that she was only going to allow herself to see part of right now. In the middle of all of this, because the rest of it was going to take a quieter moment than this to receive properly, she walked Blackjack toward him. "You all right?" Silas asked. "Yes." She looked down at her coat. "I'm covered in mud." "You are," he agreed. "Did we lose any cattle?" "Two got through the east fence. They'll be recovered." "Anyone hurt?" "Not that I've heard." She nodded. She sat for another moment on Blackjack's back, and the applause was fading now, and the crowd was dispersing, and the grounds were becoming ordinary. Again, in the way that grounds become ordinary very quickly after extraordinary things happen, because life has a way of immediately beginning to cover its own tracks. Then she heard a voice she didn't know, and looked sideways at a man who was standing at the rope line, with his hands on the top strand and his full attention on her and the horse. Broad-chested, good coat. Owen Burrell. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "My original offer. I'd like to revise it." Clara looked at him. "I'm not selling him," she said. Burrell blinked. Then, slowly, he said, "I wasn't going to offer to buy him." She waited. "I was going to offer a breeding contract," Burrell said. "First right of access to his offspring, 5 years, at a rate per successful foal that I think you'll find considerably more interesting than what I put on that paper this morning." He paused. "You keep the horse. You build the program. I provide the mares and the market." Clara looked at Silas. Silas's expression was doing several things simultaneously, but the dominant one was a quiet, settled satisfaction that she recognized as the face of a man who had been right about something he hadn't said out loud. She looked back at Burrell. "Write the number down," she said. "I'll consider it tonight." He pulled out a card and wrote on it and handed it through the rope. She took it and looked at the number and then put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. She turned Blackjack back toward his pen. Behind her, she heard Voss's voice somewhere in the dispersing crowd, talking, explaining something to someone, the words indistinct. She thought about turning to look at him. She decided it wasn't worth the motion. She rode Blackjack through the settling exhibition grounds, and he walked quietly under her, and the mud on her coat was starting to dry in the wind, and the sun was coming back out from behind the departing storm, with the particular brightness that October saves for after the rain. And she thought about Burrell's number and Silas's face, and the sound of that crowd when it figured out what it was watching. She thought about Edmund, briefly. She thought he would have laughed at the cattle part. He had always liked a story where the chaos resolved, where the thing that looked like a disaster turned out to be the moment everything changed. Thought, me too. She got Blackjack back to his pen and unsaddled him and ran her hands over him, checking for anything the afternoon had cost him, and he stood still for it with his head hanging in the loose, relaxed way that meant he was tired and okay with being tired, which was the hoarse equivalent of a long exhale after a hard day. She pressed her forehead briefly against the side of his neck. "We did it," she said, to no one in particular. Blackjack's ear moved toward her voice. She took that as agreement. Burrell's number sat in her coat pocket for the entire ride home. She didn't look at it again. She didn't need to. She'd read it once, and it had gone into her memory the way important numbers do, with a weight and clarity that made reviewing the physical paper unnecessary. She knew what it said. She needed time to sit with what it meant, which was a different thing entirely. The wagon ride back was quieter than the ride out had been. The storm had cleared and left the kind of evening that October produced occasionally, almost as an apology for the earlier violence, the sky going orange and purple in the west, the air sharp and clean, the road ahead of them catching the last light in a way that made everything look briefly significant. Blackjack walked behind the wagon on a loose lead, tired in the honest way of an animal that had spent its resources on something real, his head low, his steps steady. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Silas and watched the road and thought. The breeding contract 5 years, first access to offspring, the per foal rate that Burrell had written on the card was not just a financial solution. It was a different kind of future than the one she'd been calculating toward. She'd been thinking in terms of survival, get through this winter, hold the land, find a way to make the numbers work one season at a time. Burrell's offer wasn't survival arithmetic. It was something longer than that. It was the kind of proposition that assumed Juniper Hollow would still be operating in 5 years and had opinions about what it would look like when it was. She found that she had opinions about that too. "You're thinking loud," Silas said. "I'm always thinking loud. Usually I can't hear it." He kept his eyes on the road. "Tonight I can." She looked at him sideways. "Burrell's contract would cover the winter. It would cover the next 3 winters if we're careful." She paused. "And if I keep Blackjack, and if the breeding program works, in 5 years Juniper Hollow has a reputation that Voss can't touch." "Yes," Silas said. "That's a lot of ifs. Everything worth doing is." He was quiet a moment. "What's stopping you from saying yes?" Clara thought about that honestly. "Nothing," she said finally. "I think I'm just not used to things working out." Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. "Neither am I," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet that had become their particular language, the one that didn't require filling. She signed Burrell's contract 3 days later, after she'd read it twice and had May read it once, and made 2 amendments that Burrell accepted without argument, which told her the original terms had been slightly more favorable to his position than to hers, and he'd known it and hadn't expected her to catch it. Caught it. He seemed to find that satisfactory rather than annoying, which was the right response and improved her opinion of him. The railway supplier came to Juniper Hollow the following week. His name was Alderman, and he represented a freight operation that ran cattle between the territorial ranches and the processing facilities further east. The exhibition, it turned out, had produced witnesses to Blackjack's performance in the cattle run who had talked, the way witnesses always talked, and the story that had traveled was the true story for once not embellished. Not diminished, just the account of a woman on a horse that everyone said couldn't be ridden, working the cattle in a crisis better than the professional cowboys on either side of her. Alderman wanted a recurring cattle contract. The terms he offered were better than anything the Clearwater County Livestock Association had ever put on the table, and they came without Voss's fingerprints anywhere on them. Clara negotiated for an hour and a half. She got 2 concessions he hadn't initially offered, and gave up one she'd included specifically to have something to give up, which was a technique Edmund had taught her in the first year of their marriage, and which she'd never had occasion to use until now. She shook Alderman's hand on the porch of the house Edmund had built, and watched him ride back toward town, and stood for a while in the cold November air feeling the particular complicated mixture of relief and something else she didn't have a clean word for. She'd done it. She had, more precisely, done it. She needed to be clear about that in her own accounting, because the past 4 months had involved Silas and May and Blackjack and various other forms of help that she hadn't been too proud to accept. The fight had been hers. The decision not to sign Voss's paper had been hers. The decision to bring Blackjack to the exhibition had been hers, when most of the available evidence suggested it was a spectacular form of self-destruction. The decision to ride into that cattle run had been hers. The outcomes had come from the decisions. She held that thought for a moment, straightforwardly, without the reflex toward modesty that she'd noticed in herself over the past 2 years, the habit of immediately redistributing credit, explaining away her own part in things, treating her own competence as a temporary condition rather than something she'd built. She let herself own it. Then she went inside to make coffee, because owning things took about 30 seconds and there was still work to do. It was Silas who started pulling away, and she didn't see it coming as clearly as she should have, which she would later attribute to the fact that she'd been busy, genuinely, legitimately busy, in a way that took her full attention and left less room than usual for reading the people around her. First sign was small. He started coming to the corral a few minutes later each morning. Not much 5 minutes, then 10. She noticed it the way you notice a change in ambient temperature, registering it as information without immediately knowing what to do with the information. The second sign was that he'd started finding reasons to work on his own side of the fence line rather than hers. Legitimate reasons his own operation, which she'd been aware was being somewhat neglected while they'd been focused on the exhibition, needed attention. She understood that. She didn't fault him for it. But there was a before and an after to the way he distributed his time, and she was aware of the after even when she didn't say so. The third sign was a conversation he didn't finish. She'd stopped by his property one afternoon to check on a fence section they'd agreed to repair jointly her posts, his wire, a practical arrangement that had grown out of the formal partnership discussion they'd started and not quite completed. He was in the barn when she arrived, doing something with a harness that appeared to absorb considerably more of his attention than harness repair usually required. "You've got a minute?" she asked. "Sure." He didn't put the harness down. "I wanted to finish the conversation about the partnership structure. If we're going to pool the cattle operation for winter, we need to settle the terms before mines." "We don't have to do that," he said. She waited. He stopped. Put down the harness. Looked at the wall for a moment like it contained something useful. "You've got the breeding contract now. The alderman deal. You've got what you need for winter. That doesn't mean the partnership doesn't make sense." "It made sense when you were short," he said, and his voice was careful in a way that she recognized as the voice of a man choosing words he'd thought about in advance. "You're not short anymore. You don't need the arrangement." Clara stood in the doorway of his barn and looked at him. "I'm aware of what I need," she said. "I'm talking about what might make sense for both of us." Something moved through his expression that he didn't quite manage to keep off his face. She caught it, the flicker of something that was neither argument nor agreement, but something more complicated. Something that had to do with the space between the practical conversation and the other conversation that had been sitting underneath the practical one for a while now. "I'll think about it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Silas," she said, "what's happening?" "Nothing's happening." She left it there because she'd learned that pushing a man toward a conversation he wasn't ready to have was about as productive as the early rope sessions with Blackjack. You could force proximity, but you couldn't force anything useful out of it. She went home. She thought about it that night, and the night after, and she arrived at an understanding she didn't particularly want to arrive at, but couldn't argue with. Things had resolved. From Silas's perspective, the problem was solved. The ranch was safe. The contract was signed. Blackjack was trained. And the reason they'd been spending every morning together for 4 months had completed itself. And a man who had spent years leaving places when they started to feel like home had just watched the last practical reason to stay turn into a solved equation. She understood it. She didn't like it. She thought about the fence rail that night in October, the cold air and Blackjack's breath warm against her palm, and Silas saying, "I'm not thinking about this as temporary." She thought about the particular quality of that statement, the quietness of it, the weight of it, the fact that he'd said it's like a man putting something valuable down carefully, rather than a man performing emotion for an audience. She thought, people mean things when they say them, and then the circumstances around the meaning change, and the meaning has to compete with the fear, and sometimes the fear is faster. She knew about that. She'd spent 2 years letting the fear be faster than the alternatives. She got up the next morning and went to the corral and spent time with Blackjack, because that was the thing she could do something about right now. And it was the thing that reliably reminded her of what patient work actually looked like when you did it correctly. The morning she found Silas loading his wagon was 3 weeks after the exhibition. She'd come over to check the joint fence section, because the weather had been hard the past few days and she wanted to know how the posts were holding. She came around the side of his barn and stopped. The wagon was half loaded, not haphazardly carefully, the way a man packs who has thought about what he's doing and decided to do it neatly. Tack and tools, some kitchen things, a bedroll. The kind of load that could mean a supply run to town and could mean something else entirely, and she read it in about 2 seconds as the something else. Silas was at the back of the wagon when he heard her. Turned. They looked at each other. "Where are you going?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "There's a property near Billings," he said. "Someone I met at the exhibition mentioned it. Good grazing, reasonable price. It makes sense to take a look." "Take a look," Clara said. "It's worth exploring." She felt the cold, flat anger she'd felt when Voss walked into her kitchen. But this was different. This was directed at something she cared about far more than a business adversary, which made it more complicated and more dangerous, and considerably harder to express without making things worse. "You're leaving," she said. "I'm looking at another property." "Silas." She let the word sit there for a second. "Don't explain it to me as something else." He looked at her. He looked, briefly, like a man who has been caught doing the thing he was planning to do, and is aware that there is no version of this conversation in which he doesn't know that she knows, and deciding whether to proceed as if the pretense is still workable. He decided not to. I don't know how to do this, he said. And it was the honesty of it, the plain unvarnished directness of it, that hit her harder than any articulate argument would have. Do what? Stay. Build something and stay in it. He looked at the wagon, then back at her. Every time something I've built starts to matter, I find a reason to move on. I know that's what I'm doing right now. He stopped. I'm not pretending it's purely practical. Clara stood in the cold morning air and thought about several different things she could say, and chose the one that was truest. You lost your brother, she said. He went very still. And then you spent years making sure you were never in a position to lose anything else that mattered that much. She kept her voice level, not gentle, not hard, just honest, the way she'd learned to be honest when the stakes were real. I understand that. I spent 2 years after Edmund died, making sure everything I did was something I could do alone, specifically so I'd never have to depend on someone and have them disappear. Clara, I'm not finished. She wasn't. The difference between us is that I've been learning something different for 4 months. Something this horse has been teaching both of us, if you were paying attention. Silas was watching her with an expression she couldn't categorize. It was too many things at once. Blackjack doesn't trust because he's safe, she said. He trusts because he decided the risk was worth it. Every morning he makes that decision again. He's not sure. He's never going to be completely sure whatever was done to him. He's going to carry some of that forever. But he still comes to the fence. He still puts his head in that halter. She paused. You taught me to see that as courage, not recklessness. She let that sit. The wagon was still half loaded. The morning was still cold. Silas was still standing at the back of the wagon, looking at her with that expression that was too many things at once. I'm not asking you to be sure, she said. I'm not asking you to have this whole thing figured out. I'm asking you to... She stopped herself from finishing that sentence, because what she'd been about to say was the thing that she'd been carrying for a while and hadn't said, and she wasn't going to say it here, in his yard, with his wagon half loaded. Some things needed different conditions. Just don't go. Not today. Give me one reason to believe this isn't you doing what you've always done. He was quiet for so long that she prepared herself for the possibility that he was going to finish loading the wagon. Then he said, "Show me the horse." She didn't know what he meant by it immediately. He said it like it had a specific meaning that she should understand. And she turned it over for a moment while they walked back toward her property, and then she thought she understood and felt something tighten in her chest with the quality of a held breath. Blackjack came to the fence when they crossed the yard. He did that reliably now, had been doing it for weeks, appeared in the mornings at the near rail like a standing appointment. He looked at Clara. He looked at Silas. His ears moved in that cataloging way, reading the situation, assessing the information available. Silas unlatched the gate and went in. He went to the center of the corral the way he'd gone that first morning, months ago, that quiet, angled approach, presenting small, not pressing. He stood still. Blackjack looked at him. Clara stood at the gate and watched. Silas waited. Blackjack walked to the near fence, opposite from where Silas stood. He put his nose to the rail and looked at Clara. Silas waited. Blackjack looked back at Silas. He did not move toward him. It wasn't the dramatic refusal she might have expected. No pinned ears, no pacing, no obvious tension. The stallion simply stood at the near fence and looked at Silas with a calm, clear attention and did not move his feet. Silas stood in the center of the corral and waited, and after 3 full minutes of waiting, he turned and looked at Clara across the distance between them, and his expression had arrived, somewhere she hadn't seen it before. "He's waiting for you," Silas said. Clara stepped through the gate. The moment her boots hit the corral dirt, Blackjack pushed off the near fence and walked directly toward her, not at a hurry, not anxious, just the unhurried, purposeful walk of an animal going to the person it has chosen. He stopped beside her, turned slightly, putting himself between her and Silas in the way he sometimes did, not protectively exactly, just present, claiming his position. Silas looked at the horse. He looked at Clara. He looked at the horse again. He chose, Silas said. It was very quiet. He always chooses, Clara said. Every morning. He makes the same choice. Silas was still for a long moment. He took 3 steps toward Clara and Blackjack. Blackjack's ear moved toward him, not away, not alarmed, interested. Silas stopped within arm's reach of the stallion. He held out his hand, the flat of his palm turned up, the way you offered an open hand to a horse you knew well. Blackjack looked at it, Then he put his nose into Silas's palm. It was the gesture of a horse that had decided something. Not a neutral gesture, a declaration. If horses made declarations, which Clara had come to believe they did, in their particular, wordless language. The stallion was telling both of them something, and both of them received it in the same moment, and the corral was quiet and cold, and the morning was the only witness. Silas lifted his eyes to Clara. "Give me one reason to stay," he said. It was different from the last time she'd heard that phrase, or a version of it. She'd thought about this. She'd had 3 weeks of watching him pull back to think about it, and what she'd arrived at was this: there was nothing to argue. Either you wanted the thing you'd built together, or you didn't, and no amount of eloquent reasoning would make someone want something they didn't want, and no amount of fear would make someone stop wanting something they actually did. She looked at him steadily. "Because I'm not asking you to save me," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix anything, or carry anything, or be responsible for anything that isn't yours. I'm asking you to build something with me, something we make together, something where neither of us is carrying the other one, but we're both carrying the same weight." Put her hand on Blackjack's neck, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The horse was part of what she meant, was in some way what she meant. All of it, the months of work and patience and showing up and trying again. This ranch, this horse, this... She gestured at the space between them, at the gate, at the fence line between their two properties that had stopped feeling like a boundary some time ago. Whatever this is. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He lowered his hand from Blackjack's nose. He said, "Okay." She looked at him. "Okay," he said again. And it was not a statement of surrender, not a man giving in to something. It was a man deciding something. The difference between those two things was everything. She looked down at the ground for a second. Because her face was doing something, she needed a moment to manage. "The wagon," she said. "I'll unload it. I'll help." They went. Silas unloaded the wagon, and Clara stacked things back in the barn, and neither of them made a production of what had just happened. That was something she'd come to appreciate about him, that he didn't require ceremony around important moments, didn't need them underlined or reflected back to him in the form of reassurance. Things happened, and then you went and did the next thing, and the doing of the next thing was itself the confirmation that the thing had happened. They had lunch at her kitchen table. He ate 2 portions of the bean soup she'd had on the stove and told her the joint fence section needed 4 new posts before serious snow came, and she told him she'd had a letter from a rancher in Billings who'd heard about Blackjack and wanted to inquire about the breeding program, the first such inquiry and considerably sooner than she'd expected, and he said May must have talked to someone. And she said that was exactly what she thought. It was the most ordinary lunch she'd had in 2 years. She thought that maybe ordinary was what she'd been missing. Winter came in the 3rd week of November, which was early even by Montana standards. It came hard and stayed that way, the kind of winter that made you understand in a physical, non-abstract sense why the territory had a reputation. Clara had survived 2 of them already, but this one was the first in 3 years that she wasn't facing alone. And the difference was not primarily practical, though it was practically significant. Having 2 sets of hands and 2 sets of animals and 2 operations that could shore each other up when one section was faltering. The difference was also something she would only have been able to articulate to someone who had spent a winter alone in a house that was too quiet, and that was this. Having someone to talk to at the end of a hard day changed the composition of the hardness. Not eliminated it, changed it. Silas spent most of the winter working both sides of the fence line. He slept in his own house, because they were careful people, and neither of them was interested in moving faster than the thing between them could naturally move. But he was over at Juniper Hollow by 6 most mornings, and often stayed through supper. And the gate between their 2 properties stopped being shut. Blackjack wintered well. Clara had worried about him, the cold, the reduced activity, whether the confined months would undo some of what they'd built through the active summer and fall. But the stallion, who had once been an animal that seemed to require conflict in order to function, turned out to have a genuine capacity for peace that had simply been buried under everything that had happened to him. He was still not an easygoing horse, he never would be, and she'd stopped expecting that. He was watchful and particular, and he had opinions about things, and those opinions were expressed clearly and sometimes physically. The fear was different now, smaller and less in charge. The first breeding mare arrived in January from Burrell's operation, a tall gray daughter of working ranch stock, confident and well-tempered. Clara had worried about how Blackjack would handle a strange horse on his territory. She needn't have. He was curious rather than aggressive, investigative rather than territorial, and within 2 days the two horses were sharing the corral with the matter-of-fact ease of animals that have decided each other is not a threat. Burrell came in February to see for himself and stayed 2 days and left satisfied in the particular way of a man who had made a good business decision and was watching it confirm itself on schedule. Voss did not come. She heard news of him through the winter, the kind of news that traveled through Clearwater County, without needing any one person to carry it deliberately. The alderman contract, it turned out, had not been the only contract he'd lost after the exhibition. 2 other ranchers had found independent buyers in the months following, encouraged by what Clara's situation had demonstrated. Nothing dramatic, nothing that threatened his overall position, but a loosening of the grip, a reminder that the grip had limits. Clara did not celebrate that exactly, but she noted it. March came, and the snow started thinking about leaving. Clara found the letter from a woman named Doris Hatch, over in Creighton County, in the 2nd week of March. Mrs. Hatch had a 12-year-old mare with a history she described in 3 careful sentences that Clara read and understood immediately, a horse that had been mishandled, that couldn't be caught, that 3 different handlers had given up on. She had heard about what Clara Whitlock had done with the Juniper Hollow stallion, and she was wondering if Mrs. Whitlock might be willing to take a look. Clara put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it. Silas came in from the morning feeding and saw it and picked it up, because in the 4 months of winter they'd arrived at the comfortable arrangement of reading each other's mail in the sense of leaving things out that were meant to be seen and not leaving out things that weren't. He read it. "What are you going to tell her?" he asked. "I don't know yet. You know." She looked at him. "I've got enough going on." "You do," he agreed. "And you're going to write back to Mrs. Hatch because you can't not." He set the letter down. "It's what you do." It was not a criticism. It was observation, delivered in the even tone of a man who had spent 4 months watching someone be who they were and had arrived at a comprehensive understanding of it. Clara picked up the letter. She thought about what May had said in the fall about buyers falling into categories, the ones who wanted finished products and the ones who wanted potential. She thought about Blackjack, who had been potential wrapped in damage, and what he'd become, and the fact that what he'd become was not something separate from what he'd been, but the same thing with the fear removed. She thought about what it meant to know you could do something. Particular quality of that knowledge, not confidence exactly, which she'd always associated with a certain bravado she didn't feel. Something quieter. Something that had been built in the mornings in the corral, one small increment at a time. "I'll write back," she said. Silas nodded. He sat down at the table across from her and poured coffee, and they sat in the morning quiet of the kitchen. And outside the window, the March light was doing what March light does when winter finally starts to lose its argument, coming in, low and pale and tentative, testing whether it was welcome. Clara started the letter. It did not take her long. She knew what she was going to say. She'd always known. She thought from the moment she'd read, "I have heard about what you did with the Juniper Hollow stallion." She'd known. She was going to say yes. She was going to go see the mare, and she was going to assess what was actually there under the history, and she was going to try to figure out what the horse needed, rather than what was easiest to give it, and she was probably going to be frustrated and humbled and wrong several times before she was right, and it was going to take as long as it took. She sealed the letter. She looked at Silas across the table. "Spring's coming," she said. He looked out the window at the pale light. "About time," he said. Thought, yes. She thought, it really is. Doris Hatch's mare was named Pepper, and she was exactly as bad as the letter had described and somewhat worse in person. Clara made the trip to Creighton County in the 1st week of April, when the roads had dried enough to be passable, but still had the particular unpredictability of spring ground that hadn't fully decided what it was going to be yet. She went alone. Silas had offered to come, and she'd said no. Not because she didn't want his company, but because she needed to know what she was looking at without anyone else's read influencing her first impression. She'd learned that about herself over the winter, that her best assessments happened when she had a moment of quiet before the opinions of people she trusted got mixed into her own. Pepper was a bay mare, 12 years old, with a solid build, and the kind of bone structure that told you she'd been a good horse once, maybe a very good horse, before whoever had handled her in the intervening years had systematically dismantled whatever trust she'd started with. She couldn't be caught in the open field. She cow-kicked when cornered. She'd put one handler on the ground hard enough to crack 2 of his ribs, which Doris Hatch mentioned with the guilty expression of a woman who felt responsible for damage done by an animal she'd failed to protect from the people who damaged it first. Clara stood at the field fence for 40 minutes before she said anything to Mrs. Hatch. "How long has she been like this?" Clara asked. 3 years, near as I can tell. I bought her 4 years ago. She was already nervous then, but manageable. The man I hired to work with her." Doris stopped. He wasn't the right man. I didn't know that until after. Clara watched Pepper move at the far end of the field. The mare's movement was good. She hadn't been physically broken, just psychologically, which was in some ways worse, and in some ways more workable. The body remembered things the mind had given up on. Clara had learned that. "I can't promise anything," Clara said. "I won't tell you I can fix her, because I don't know yet what's fixable and what she's just going to carry. But I can tell you what I see." "What do you see?" "I see a horse that's still making decisions." Clara kept her eyes on the mare. When an animal stops making decisions, when they just react, that's when you've really lost them. She's still thinking. She's choosing that far corner. She's watching us and calculating. That's something. Doris Hatch was quiet for a moment. She was a small woman in her 60s, with the particular worn quality of someone who had been working hard land for a long time, and had arrived at a kind of solid endurance that wasn't resignation but wasn't optimism either. Just the honest appraisal of someone who knew what things cost. "Can you help her?" Doris asked. Clara turned from the fence. "I'm going to try," she said. She came back to Juniper Hollow and told Silas about the mare over supper, and he listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, without preparing his response while she was still talking. "How long?" he asked when she was done. "I don't know. Longer than Blackjack, probably. She's older, and the damage is more recent, which sounds counterintuitive, but it matters. Recent damage is rawer. Less time for the animal to build compensating habits around it." She paused. "I told Mrs. Hatch I'd come twice a week. She can't bring the mare here. The travel would be too much right now. So I'll go to her. That's a 2-hour ride each way." "I know." He didn't say anything further about it, which she appreciated. He understood by now that pointing out the practical difficulty of a thing she'd already decided to do was not particularly useful information. "Mrs. Hatch can't pay much," Clara said. She was honest about that. "Does that change it?" "No," he nodded. He handed her the breadbasket. "Spring breeding season starts in 3 weeks, he said. "Burrell's sending 4 more mares." "I know. I've got the schedule." "You're going to be busy." "I'm always going to be busy," Clara said. "It's not a problem. That's just what it looks like now." She said it without drama, just as fact. She felt the truth of it, even as she said it, that this was what it looked like now, the life she was building. And it was a complicated and demanding life, but it was hers in a way that the 2 years of pure survival hadn't been. Surviving wasn't building. She'd understood that intellectually for a long time. She was only now understanding it in her body. Spring came in fully by the middle of April, and brought with it the particular organized chaos of a ranch operation expanding into warmer weather. Burrell's 4 mares arrived as scheduled, handled by a young man named Garrett, who worked for Burrell's breeding operation, and had the competent, unshowy manner of someone trained to care about animals rather than impress people. Clara liked him immediately. He stayed for 2 days to help settle the mares and watched Clara work with Blackjack with the attentive silence of a person storing information. On the second morning, he asked her how she'd learned the method. "From the horse mostly," she said, "and from someone who knew how to watch." Garrett nodded like that made complete sense, which told her he was smarter than his age suggested. Blackjack took to the breeding season with an authority that surprised Clara a little, though she thought later that it shouldn't have. The stallion had always known what he was, had always had that quality of self-possession underneath the fear, the sense of a horse that understood its own significance and was waiting for the world to catch up. Watching him with the mares, she saw something she hadn't seen before. He was patient, careful, not the explosive, reactive animal who had nearly destroyed her north fence and himself along with it, but something more considered. Something that had learned, the same way she had, that you got further by being steady than by being loud. She thought, we learned the same things at the same time, from each other. She thought that was probably not an accident. May Dunnock came by in May. She arrived unannounced, which was her way, riding a horse that moved like it was made of opinions, pulling up in Clara's yard with the brisk efficiency of someone who had several places to be and had allocated a specific amount of time to each. I need to tell you something, May said, before she'd even dismounted. Get down and tell me over coffee, Clara said. May got down. Over coffee, she told Clara that Harlan Voss had approached her in town the previous week. He'd been cordial, which May described as having the quality of weather that's too nice for the season, technically pleasant, and fundamentally untrustworthy. He'd asked about the Juniper Hollow breeding program. Not aggressively, not with any obvious angle. He'd just asked, in the way of a man gathering information he might need later. What did you tell him? Clara asked. That it was doing well and that you were a formidable woman, and that he should probably stop wasting both your time and his. May drank her coffee. He didn't seem to find that particularly satisfying. Good. I think he's decided to wait you out, May said. Not actively move against you. Just watch for you to stumble and be positioned to respond when you do. Clara considered that. Then I won't stumble, she said. That's not really how stumbling works. No, Clara agreed. What I mean is if I do stumble, I get up. And the operation is far enough along now that one stumble doesn't end it. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He needed me to fail quickly, in the first winter. That window is closed. He's not going to wait 10 years. May looked at her with the gray-eyed steadiness that Clara had come to recognize as her version of approval. You've changed, May said. Since the fall, have I? You were competent before. Now you're something else. She thought about it. Settled. Like you're not fighting for the right to be here anymore. You're just here. Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the version of herself who had been sitting on the fence rail with a useless rope 3 months after Edmund died, certain that she was one bad season away from losing everything. Furious and frightened in equal measure, and not distinguishing very carefully between the two. She thought about how much energy that had taken the constant proof gathering, the constant anticipation of the next argument she'd have to win just to stay where she already was. She thought at some point the proving stopped, and she hadn't noticed exactly when it happened. The horse did that, Clara said. Partly. The horse and the man, May said, without any particular tone about it. Yes, Clara said both. Silas asked her to marry him in September. It was not the most romantic occasion by any conventional measure. They were fixing a section of the shared fence line this time together, the way they'd taken to doing most things. And the work was going slowly because the ground was still harder than it should have been, and one of the posts had gone in at a wrong angle and had to come out and be restarted. Clara was frustrated with the post, and expressing that frustration in the direct, unsentimental way she expressed most things. And Silas was holding the post steady while she worked the digger, and he said, quite quietly, without any preamble, I'd like you to marry me. She stopped digging. She looked at him over the post. He was looking back at her with the expression she'd catalogued and come to know as his most serious face, not solemn exactly, but fully present. Fully meaning it, nothing held back or qualified. Now, she said, you're asking me now? We're in a pheasant's post hole. I've been thinking about it since March, he said. I didn't want to wait for a better moment and have the better moment never come. She looked at the digger in her hands. She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of silence in a house and 4 months of learning what patience actually required, and a winter that had been the warmest she could remember, despite the temperature in a spring that had started. Something she didn't have a name for yet, but knew was real. She thought Edmund would have laughed at this. She thought he would have liked Silas. Yes, she said. She went back to the fence post. Silas held it steady. After a moment, he said, That's it? What else do you want? I don't know. Something. I said, Yes, Silas. That's the something. She looked up at him. Hold the post straight. He held the post straight. But she saw what happened to his face. In the moment before he turned away to check the angle, the unguarded thing, the thing that had nothing to do with reserve or control, just a man who had been afraid of staying anywhere long enough to love it, finally understanding that he'd already done it and the sky hadn't fallen. She made herself look back at the fence post. She was smiling so hard it was making the work difficult, and she wasn't going to mention that. They married in December, The same month, the first foal from the Juniper Hollow breeding program arrived. The foal was from Burrell's gray mare, a leggy, dark bay colt with Blackjack's conformation and his mother's temperament, which meant he was curious and direct, and not particularly afraid of things that hadn't hurt him yet. Clara stood in the barn in the early hours of a December morning watching the colt find his feet on the straw and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name, just received. Silas was beside her. He'd been there for the birth, the way he'd been present for most things by now, not as a guest, not as someone who had to be invited, but as someone who belonged to the particular gravity of the place and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. "He's good," Silas said. "He's very good," Clara said. She watched the colt try his legs again, stumble. "Correct. He's going to be better than his father. Blackjack's not done yet. No. But this one's going to be something." She didn't know exactly what she meant by that, except that she did know she could see it in the quality of the colt's attention, the way he looked at things. Combination of caution and genuine interest that she'd come to recognize as the signature of an animal capable of the particular kind of trust that was worth having. Not blind trust, not the absence of judgment, the kind that was offered deliberately, on assessment, and renewed every morning. The wedding had been small. Clara hadn't wanted large. She'd never been comfortable with events that required everyone to look at her all at once for sustained periods, and Silas had suggested carefully, in the manner of a man who had learned when to suggest and when to be silent, that a small ceremony with the people who mattered was probably more honest anyway. May had been there. Burrell had sent a gift. Garrett from Burrell's operation had appeared unexpectedly and ate more food than everyone else combined, which had made Clara genuinely fond of him. Doris Hatch had come, Pepper now catchable in the open field, after 7 months of twice-weekly visits, which was the kind of progress that didn't make headlines, but was the most satisfying kind. They combined the ranch operations the following spring, as they'd been discussing since winter. The formal paperwork took longer than the practical reality. The practical reality had been mostly combined since January. Operations flowing back and forth across the property line, with the easy logic of two systems that had been designed, without knowing it, to work together. Clara captained the Juniper Hollow. Silas had been the one to insist on that, which still surprised her occasionally when she thought about it, that he'd been more protective of the name than she'd been, in the period when she was so exhausted from surviving that she'd stopped being sentimental about the details. "You fought for this place," he'd said. "The name is part of what you fought for. Days." She hadn't argued. Voss sold 3 of his county properties the following year. Clara heard about it the way she heard most news through May, through the organic county telegraph, through the slow accumulation of information that flowed into a ranch operation the way water flowed into low ground. She didn't know the full story, and didn't look for it. What she understood was that the loosening of his grip that had started after the exhibition had continued, quietly and incrementally, as more ranchers found independent contracts and the monopoly on buyer relationships that had been his primary power began to develop cracks. She didn't feel triumphant about that either. She noticed she didn't feel triumphant and thought about why, and concluded that it was because the fight with Voss had never been about him, really. He'd been the obstacle, not the point. The point had been the land and the horse and the work and the choices she'd made about what kind of person she was going to be when the pressure was high enough that being that person was expensive. The point had been proving something to herself that she already knew but needed to know differently, not theoretically, not as an inherited understanding from Edmund or anyone else, but through the particular stubborn laboratory of her own experience. She knew it now. Blackjack lived for 22 years. He died on a Tuesday in November. In the paddock he'd occupied for 19 of those years, in the particular way of old horses who decide quietly, without drama, that they've finished. Clara found him in the morning. She stood with him for a while after, in the cold, not crying exactly, though something was happening in her face and chest that would have looked like crying from the outside. Silas came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he had a good life. He did. She looked at the old black horse, the gray now working through his muzzle and around his eyes, the body still solid even in age. He had a hard beginning and a good life. Those things were both true. Both things being true, Silas said. You've said that before. It keeps being relevant. They stood together in the morning cold, the two of them, In the paddock where 19 years earlier, on a morning that neither of them had known would become the hinge of everything a frightened horse had taken 3 steps toward a quiet man who had learned to stop pursuing and just be present. Clara thought about what it had all come from. Not just the breeding program, which was real and solid and had in the intervening years produced horses that worked on operations across 4 counties. Not just the marriage or the combined ranch or the work with Doris Hatch's mare that had grown, without any plan on Clara's part, into a steady stream of ranchers arriving with animals that other people had given up on. All of that had come from a morning when she'd been sitting on a fence rail with a useless rope, exhausted and angry, and a voice behind her had said something true. She'd let the truth in. That was the thing when she looked back at it. That was the hinge. Not her stubbornness, which she'd had her whole life. Not her competence, which she'd also had, though she hadn't always known it. Not Silas, though he'd mattered more than she had words for. It was the moment she'd been willing to hear something she didn't already know, from a person she hadn't invited about a problem she thought she understood. It was the moment she'd opened the corral gate and said, "Then come inside and show me what I'm doing wrong." Everything had walked through that gate. She thought there was something in that worth holding on to. Something about the difference between strength that knows everything and strength that knows what it doesn't know. She'd spent 2 years believing that needing help was a form of weakness, that the only version of herself worth being was the version that required nothing and no one. She'd been wrong about that in a way that had cost her, and she didn't regret the cost because the education had been worth it. But she wouldn't have chosen the slow way if she'd had the choice. The lesson, as best she could state it, was simple and not easy. Being strong didn't mean carrying everything alone. It meant knowing what you were carrying and what could be shared, and having the clarity to tell the difference. The gate between the 2 original properties stayed open. This was both practical and not practical. Cattle moved through it freely. Equipment went back and forth. The daily operations of Juniper Hollow, in its combined form, made the gate's function purely nominal. But they kept it, maintained it, kept it hinged and usable, even as the fence line it was part of became increasingly vestigial. Clara understood why without discussing it. The gate was the record of a choice. A specific morning, a specific decision, a woman who had been about to do things the only way she knew how, and had instead opened an entrance she didn't know where it led. Some mornings, the mornings when the light came in low from the east and hit the juniper trees along the creek and turned the whole east edge of the property silver, she would stand at that gate and feel the full weight of the life on both sides of it. The years before, which had made her who she was. The years after, which had made her something more than that. She was not a person given to large statements about what things meant. She'd grown up practical and stayed practical and trusted practicality more than she trusted philosophy, which she associated with people who had enough leisure to avoid the actual problem and enough language to make the avoidance sound like wisdom. But she had a few things she'd learned that she held as close to true as anything she'd encountered. She'd learned that the most important things took longer than you thought they should, and that the length was part of the process and not a failure of it. She'd learned that damaged things, horses, people, relationships, self-conceptions were not the same as broken things, and that the difference mattered enormously, and that the people who couldn't see the difference were usually the ones causing the damage in the first place. She'd learned that love the real, working, unglamorous kind that showed up at 6:25 in the morning and held a fence post straight and unloaded a wagon it had half-loaded.
And sat across a kitchen table through a Montana winter without once making her feel like she owed it anything.
Was not the soft thing that songs made it out to be. It was one of the harder things. It required the same quality that everything worth having required, the willingness to keep showing up even when the outcome wasn't certain. She'd learned that from a horse. She thought that said something important, though she wasn't sure she could articulate exactly what. Something about how the things that teach you the most important lessons are rarely the things you chose for that purpose. Blackjack had been a financial gamble, a borderline desperate decision made by a woman who needed an asset and acquired a liability. He hadn't been chosen as a teacher. He'd just been what was there, and what was there had turned out to be exactly what was needed. That felt like something too. Silas asked her once it was years later, a summer evening, sitting on the porch of the house that was hers, and now also his, what she would have done if he hadn't shown up that morning. With Blackjack, she said. With any of it. She thought about it honestly. I would have figured something out, she said. I know you would have, but it would have taken longer, and it would have been lonelier. She looked out at the yard, the corral, where a young bay mare currently occupied the space that had once held an untouchable stallion, and now held whatever came next in the long progression of animals that had moved through Juniper Hollow seeking something they hadn't been able to find until they got there. I was so used to lonely that I'd stopped noticing how much of my energy went into managing it. It's expensive. Lonely is expensive. I didn't know that until I wasn't. Silas was quiet for a moment. I almost missed it, he said. The whole thing. I know. If you hadn't, he stopped. If you hadn't unloaded the wagon, she said. He nodded. She looked at him sideways. He was 58 now, and the weathering had continued, which suited him. He was a man whose face got better as it got older. Something she'd noticed and never said because she knew it would embarrass him, and she'd taken mild pleasure in that knowledge for years. You were always going to unload the wagon, she said. You don't know that. I know you, she said. The same way I knew Blackjack was going to come to the fence eventually. Not because it was guaranteed. Because I'd been watching long enough to know what was there. He looked at her. She looked back. 20 years of looking at each other across kitchen tables and fence lines and corral rails, and the particular intimate geography of a shared life. She still saw him clearly. She thought that might be the best measure of anything, not whether the picker got fuzzy with familiarity.
But whether you could still see the actual person through all the accumulated context.
Of knowing them. Could. She thought he could see her too. That was enough. That was, honestly, more than enough. The evening light moved across the yard, and the juniper trees along the creek caught it the way they always did at this hour, turning silver at the edges. And somewhere in the barn, the young bay mare moved in her stall, and the gate between the two original properties stood open the way it had stood for 19 years, and the land that had been fought for, and almost lost and fought for again, lay quiet under the summer sky. Juniper Hollow. Still here, still hers, still theirs. The name on the gate, the name that Silas had insisted on keeping, because she'd fought too hard for it to disappear, caught the last light of the evening and held it, for a moment before the darkness came. The way good things hold light not forever, but long enough to be seen, long enough to matter, long enough that you know, when it finally fades, that it was real, that it was worth it, that you would do it all again. P.